Long before temples rose on the Acropolis and assemblies gathered to debate democracy, the land that would become Athens was simply a corner of southern Greece called Attica. To understand the story of Athens, we first have to understand this land itself, because geography, climate, and early human settlement all shaped what the city would later become. Attica is a peninsula jutting into the Aegean Sea, surrounded on three sides by water and bordered by mountains on the landward side. To the north lies Mount Parnes, to the west Mount Cithaeron and Mount Gerenia, and to the east the island of Euboea across a narrow stretch of sea. Within Attica itself, smaller mountains such as Hymettus, Pentelicon, and Aigaleos break up the plains. These natural features created a landscape of enclosed valleys and open coastal zones, with a few fertile plains like the one where Athens would grow, between the hills and the sea. This geography had important consequences. The mountains made Attica somewhat separate from neighboring regions like Boeotia and the Peloponnese, giving the area a sense of unity and identity over time. At the same time, the long coastline and natural harbors, especially the bay where Piraeus would later rise, opened the region to the Aegean world. Land shaped possibilities, isolation enough to form a distinct community, connection enough to allow trade and cultural contact. Athens would eventually take advantage of both. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans were present in Attica from a very early period. In caves and open-air sites across the region, tools from the Stone Age have been found, showing that hunter-gatherers once moved through these hills and valleys. Over many generations, especially from the Neolithic period onwards, people began to settle more permanently. They learned to cultivate grains, keep animals, and form small farming communities. These early villagers did not yet know the name Athens, but they were already shaping the landscape that would belong to the city. By the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, roughly the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, small fortified or organized settlements appeared on hilltops and in defensible positions across Attica. One such hill, rising above the surrounding plain and near a natural water source, would later be called the Acropolis of Athens. Even before it became a sacred and political center, this rocky plateau had obvious advantages. It was easy to defend, it gave a clear view over the surrounding land, and it was close enough to the coast to benefit from trade, but far enough inland to be safer from sudden sea raids. During the Bronze Age, the wider Aegean world saw the rise of complex societies, especially the Minoans on Crete and the Mycenaean kingdoms on mainland Greece. Attica lay somewhat on the edge of these great centers, but it was not isolated. Pottery styles, burial customs, and scattered finds show that Attica was connected to larger trade and cultural networks. Goods and ideas flowed through the region, carried by merchants, sailors, and travelers who crossed the Aegean. Over time, this constant exchange encouraged the growth of local elites and more organized communities. In the Mycenaean period, roughly the 2nd millennium BCE, a palace center likely existed on the Athenian Acropolis or nearby, although it may have been smaller and less dominant than places like Mycenae or Pylos. Even if Athens was not the leading power of this age, the presence of Mycenaean remains suggests that the area had its own local ruler, its own warriors, and its own administrative structure. The people of Attica were no longer just villagers. They were part of a wider political and military world. Climate and resources also played a major role in shaping early life in Attica. The land was not as rich as some other Greek regions. Much of it was rocky and dry, with thin soil. However, it was suitable for certain hardy crops, such as olives, grapes, and barley. Over many years, farmers learned that olives and vines could thrive on sloping, stony ground where other crops failed. This pushed Attic agriculture toward products that would later support trade: olive oil and wine. While this transformation took a long time, the basic conditions were already in place in the prehistoric period. The dependence on olives and barley had social consequences. Farming required cooperation within families and villages, but it also created tension when harvests failed or land was unevenly distributed. Attica did not have abundant rivers, so water management and access to wells and springs were crucial. Communities gathered around reliable water sources, turning certain locations into natural hubs of settlement. The future site of Athens, with access to springs and its strategic hill, slowly became one of those hubs. At the same time, the sea offered another path for survival and growth. The coastlines of Attica provided many small bays and anchorages. People who settled near the sea could fish, sail, and trade with nearby islands such as Salamis, Aegean, and Euboea. Over time, some communities specialized more in maritime activities, building small boats and forming early trading patterns. These patterns would later expand dramatically, but their roots lay in this early familiarity with the sea. The end of the Bronze Age across the Aegean, around the late 2nd millennium BCE, brought a period of collapse and uncertainty. Many palace centers were destroyed or abandoned. Populations may have declined or moved. The causes are still debated by historians and archaeologists, with possibilities including internal conflict, invasions, natural disasters, or complex combinations of pressures. Whatever the precise reasons, the effect was clear. The world of the great palaces ended, and a simpler, more local form of life returned. One of the striking things about Athens and Attica, however, is that they seem to have escaped the worst of this destruction. While other centers fell into complete ruin, the settlement on and around the Acropolis appears to have continued without total break. This continuity would later become important in Athenian memory. Athenians liked to think of themselves as a people who had always lived in the same land, who were not immigrants, who had never been driven out and replaced. The archaeological record, showing ongoing habitation in Attica when other places were abandoned, gave some support to this proud belief. During the so-called Greek Dark Age, the centuries following the collapse of the Mycenaean world, life in Attica was simpler and poorer than before. Large palaces no longer governed wide territories. Instead, local chiefs and leading families controlled small communities. Houses were modest, grave goods were fewer, and long-distance trade decreased. Yet the basic pattern of settlement endured. People still farmed the same fields, tended olive trees, grazed animals on the same hillsides, and buried their dead near their villages. This long continuity had a quiet but powerful effect. Over many generations, shared experiences of the land, shared religious practices at local shrines, and shared memories of ancestors gradually helped form a common Attic identity. People in different valleys and small towns might once have seen themselves as quite separate, loyal mainly to a local clan leader. But as they faced the same challenges of farming a difficult landscape, as they traveled to markets or regional festivals, and as they heard and retold stories about their origins, a wider sense of belonging began to grow. Archaeological traces from the later part of this period show the gradual reappearance of more complex social forms. Pottery becomes more refined, iron tools spread, and contact with other regions slowly increases again. Burial practices change, showing both continuity with old customs and new influences from abroad. These shifts suggest that Attica was slowly recovering and reorganizing itself. The seeds of a more unified and wealthy community were being planted. In this world, there was no single founding moment when someone suddenly declared, "This is Athens." Instead, the future city grew out of many small decisions and slow processes: where to live, what to plant, who to trade with, which hill to fortify, which spring to share. These choices were shaped by the land itself. The Acropolis Hill became an obvious place of refuge, worship, and later political power because it had always stood above the plain. The surrounding area, with its mixture of arable land and access to the sea, offered a balance that favored long-term settlement. The interaction between countryside and would-be city was especially important. Attica was not dominated by a single huge plain. Instead, many smaller communities surrounded the central site. These rural villages supplied food, labor, and soldiers. In return, the central settlement, which would become Athens, offered markets, religious centers, and eventually political leadership. The relationship between city and countryside, already visible in these early times, would later define Athenian politics and society. It is also important to recognize that the people of Attica did not live in isolation from ideas about gods and the sacred. Even in prehistoric and early historic times, they worshipped deities tied to the land, fertility, and protection. Caves, springs, and hilltops became places of ritual. Over generations, certain myths and divine figures began to cluster around particular locations. The rocky hill that later hosted the Temple of Athena likely had earlier religious significance, even if we do not know all the details. Sacred places grew alongside settlements, anchoring people's sense of belonging in both landscape and story. When Athenians looked back at their own beginnings, they did not start with farming villages or pottery styles. They began with stories. For them, the true foundation of their city lay in myths of gods, kings, and heroes. These tales were not simple fairy stories. They carried political messages, explained institutions, and gave Athenians a special place in the Greek world. To understand how Athens saw itself, we need to walk for a while inside these myths, while keeping clear that they are not direct historical fact, but reflections of how people later chose to remember their past. One of the most famous stories is the contest between Athena and Poseidon for the right to be the city's divine protector. According to later tradition, the gods were gathered to decide which deity would watch over this land. Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, struck the rock with his trident and produced a saltwater spring, or a symbol of naval power. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, offered an olive tree. The people chose Athena's gift, and the city took her name. On the surface, it is a charming tale about a competition between two powerful gods, but its meaning goes deeper. By choosing Athena, Athenians told themselves that they valued intelligence and foresight over raw force. The olive tree symbolized peace, agriculture, and long-term stability. It also matched the real economic base of the region, where olives were a key crop. The story made it seem as if the landscape and the goddess were in harmony, and that the people had made a wise choice from the very beginning. Even the presence of Poseidon in the story hints at the later importance of the sea, but in the myth, his power is acknowledged and then gently set aside in favor of Athena's calmer strength. Below the divine level, Athenians imagined a line of early kings who ruled the land before there was any talk of democracy. One of the earliest and strangest is Cecrops, often described as half man and half serpent. He is said to have been the first king of the city and a civilizing figure who introduced marriage, burial customs, and the worship of the gods. His part serpent form is not just a fantasy detail. The serpent was a symbol of the earth and of deep roots in the land. By linking their first king to both human and earth powers, Athenians claimed that their community sprang directly from their own soil. This idea, called autochthony, was central to Athenian identity. Many Greek cities claimed an ancestor who had migrated from somewhere else, but Athenians insisted that they had always lived in their own land. They said they were born from the earth of Attica itself. In myth, some of their early figures literally rise from the ground, sometimes with snake-like features, as if the soil itself were giving birth to a people. In political terms, this belief supported the later idea that all Athenian citizens were brothers and equals in a special way, sharing the same original mother, the earth of Attica. Another important early king is Erechtheus, who is closely linked to the sacred places on the Acropolis. Later Athenians believed that a shrine on the Acropolis, the Erechtheion, was named after him and housed ancient cults and relics, including the marks of Poseidon's trident and the sacred olive tree of Athena. By tying a legendary king to these physical places, myth blended story and landscape. The Acropolis was not just a convenient hilltop. It was the scene of divine actions and home to heroic ancestors. This connection made religious rituals performed there feel like a direct link to the city's deepest past. As time passed, the focus of Athenian foundation myths moved from half-divine kings to more human, though still heroic, figures. The most important of these is Theseus. Many stories surround him, some shared across Greece and some specifically Athenian. He is famous for slaying the Minotaur in Crete, navigating a world of monsters and dangerous women, and proving his courage and cleverness. For Athenians, however, his greatest deed was not a monster he killed, but a political act he was said to have carried out: the unification of Attica. According to the traditional story, before Theseus, Attica was divided into many separate communities, each with its own local ruler or council. People in the countryside were loyal mainly to their own small towns. Theseus, as king of Athens, persuaded or compelled these scattered settlements to join together under one central government based in the city. The Greek term for this process is synoecism, literally dwelling together. After this unification, people still lived in their home villages, but politically, they were all Athenians. From a historical point of view, this is likely a poetic way of describing a long and complex process of political integration. Over many generations, stronger centers often absorbed weaker ones. But by giving this process a single heroic author in the person of Theseus, Athenians simplified their history into a clear story. One wise hero brought unity to the land. This had important political uses later. Whenever Athenians faced internal division, they could look back to Theseus as a symbol of unity and shared identity. Theseus also became a useful figure for balancing aristocratic pride and wider civic ideals. On the one hand, noble families liked to claim that they were descended from him or from his companions, giving themselves a heroic pedigree. On the other hand, Theseus' greatest achievement, the unification of Attica, seemed to benefit all citizens, not just a narrow elite. In this way, the myth allowed both nobles and common people to see themselves reflected in the same heroic ancestor. Another strand of Athenian tradition speaks of Ion, a figure who becomes the ancestor of the Ionian Greeks. In some versions, he is linked to Athens and its royal family. By connecting themselves to Ion, Athenians could present their city as the leading center of the Ionian people, whose colonies and cities spread across the Aegean islands and the coast of Asia Minor. This identity would later matter when Athens claimed leadership among other Ionian cities, especially in the age of the Delian League. The myth provided a family tie to support political ambitions. These stories about early kings also tried to explain specific institutions and customs. For example, some traditions say that a king named Erechtheus fought a war to defend Attica against a neighboring people, and that his daughters sacrificed themselves for the city. Such tales highlighted loyalty to the community and the idea that the city's safety was worth even the highest personal cost. In a later age, when soldiers died in battle, funeral speeches could evoke these old stories and place new deaths in a long chain of heroic sacrifice. Another king, Codrus, is said to have faced an invasion in a later mythical period. An oracle reportedly declared that the side whose king died would win the war. Codrus disguised himself, went into the enemy lines, provoked a fight, and was killed, ensuring victory for his people. After this, Athenians claimed that no one was worthy to succeed him as king, and they shifted to a different form of leadership. Whether or not any of this happened in the way it was told, the story suggested that monarchy in Athens had ended in an act of selfless devotion. Power passed from kings to magistrates, not because the people killed a tyrant, but because a king had given his life for the city. From a historian's viewpoint, these tales blend memory, invention, and political purpose. It is likely that Athens, like other Greek communities, once had real monarchs who ruled before the rise of aristocratic councils. Over time, as power moved from a single ruler to groups of leading families, the memory of kingship was pushed into the realm of legend. Kings became larger-than-life figures tied to gods and sacred places. Their stories were cleaned up, moralized, and shaped to support later institutions. For example, when Athens had a council of powerful aristocrats and annually chosen magistrates, it suited their interests to say, "We no longer need kings because our last king was too noble to be followed." At the same time, claiming descent from those same kings gave noble families a way to keep their prestige. Myth allowed people to enjoy both continuity and change at once. The religious side of these stories also mattered in everyday life. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals tied to Athena, Poseidon, Erechtheus, Theseus, and other figures were woven into the calendar of the city. When Athenians gathered on the Acropolis to honor Athena, they were not just performing a religious duty. They were also acting out their belief that the goddess herself had once stood there and claimed them as her own. When they celebrated Theseus in processions and games, they were reminded that unity was a gift from a hero who cared for all of Attica. Orators and playwrights in later centuries used these myths as familiar reference points. When they wanted to praise the city, they spoke of autochthony, of being born from the earth, of never being driven out of their homeland. When they wanted to encourage courage or self-sacrifice, they recalled Cadrus or the daughters of Erechtheus. These stories worked because ordinary Athenians knew them well and believed that, even if the details were unclear, they expressed a deeper truth about who they were. As the age of legendary kings faded into the background, Athens entered a new historical phase. Power no longer rested in the hands of a single monarch, but in the collective grip of aristocratic families. This period, stretching from the later so-called Dark Age into the early Archaic era, saw the slow building of social structures that looked very different from the world of Cecrops and Theseus, yet still carried the weight of older traditions. It is in this time that the foundations of real political conflict appear, conflicts that would eventually push Athens toward reform and, much later, democracy. By the early first millennium BCE, monarchy in Athens had largely disappeared. Instead of kings, the key offices were held by officials called archons. At first, these positions seemed to have been filled for life by members of leading families. Over time, the term of office became shorter, and more archons were added, creating a small group of powerful magistrates. These officials oversaw religious rituals, judged legal disputes, and managed military affairs. The most important offices were still restricted to the aristocracy, the so-called well-born families, known in Greek as the eupatridae. This change from kingship to aristocratic rule did not mean that power was shared widely. It simply shifted control from one individual to a network of elite clans. These families controlled large estates in the countryside and dominated public life. They led in war, presided over religious ceremonies, and settled disputes according to unwritten customs. Their authority depended not only on wealth, but on reputation, ancestry, and the ability to gather followers among dependents and clients. Outside this circle of noble families, the population of Attica was growing and changing. Smaller farmers, craftsmen, and traders were becoming more numerous. Some of them, especially those engaged in trade and artisan work, were accumulating modest wealth, but without the noble lineage needed to join the ruling elite. Others were struggling, trapped in cycles of debt and dependence. As the economy of Attica became more complex, old social arrangements that had worked in simpler times began to strain. One crucial development in this period was the increasing importance of private land ownership. As fields and pastures were divided, bought, and inherited, some families gathered more and more land, while others lost theirs. Poor farmers often needed to borrow seed grain or tools to get through bad seasons. In many cases, they offered their land and sometimes even their personal freedom as security for loans. If they could not repay, they risked losing both. The legal and social framework favored creditors, who were normally wealthy aristocrats. Many smallholders fell into a system of dependence known as debt bondage. A farmer might work his own former land, but now as a kind of serf, owing a share of the harvest to his creditor and facing the threat of being sold into slavery if he could not meet his obligations. In extreme cases, entire families could be uprooted or sold abroad. Markers called horoi were placed on lands and persons to show that they were pledged for debt. These physical signs were constant reminders of economic subordination. This growing gap between rich and poor did not arise overnight. It developed slowly as agricultural practices changed and long-distance trade expanded. Attica's position near the sea allowed merchants to import luxury goods and export products such as oil and pottery. While this trade enriched certain families, it also widened social differences. Some non-noble individuals could gain influence through commerce, but many ordinary farmers were increasingly vulnerable to crop failures and rising obligations. At the same time, the political system gave little direct voice to these poorer citizens. The aristocrats met in councils and gatherings that were formally open to the broader male citizen body, but in practice, decision-making remained in elite hands. Legal judgments depended heavily on the interpretations of noble magistrates who referred to traditional customs that were not written down. To an ordinary farmer, the law could seem like a tool that the powerful used in their own interest. Religious life was also shaped by aristocratic dominance. While the whole community took part in public festivals and sacrifices, the leading rituals were overseen by noble families with hereditary priesthoods. Control of cults and sanctuaries further cemented their prestige. They could claim to stand closest to the gods and to the heroic ancestors of Athens, reinforcing a sense of natural superiority. Military organization in this period began to reflect some of the social changes. As hoplite warfare spread across the Greek world, heavily armed infantrymen fighting in close formation became increasingly important. To equip oneself as a hoplite required a shield, helmet, spear, and body armor, which meant that only men with a certain level of wealth could afford the full panoply. This gave rise to a broader class of citizens who, while not aristocrats, were militarily significant. They could argue that because they risked their lives in battle, they deserved a greater voice in public affairs. In Athens as elsewhere, this added another layer of tension between entrenched elites and rising groups. Culturally, the Archaic period saw the spread of writing, adapted from the Phoenician alphabet. In Athens, as in many Greek communities, writing first appeared mainly on pottery, dedications, and short inscriptions. But the presence of writing itself, even in these modest forms, slowly changed the possibilities for law and memory. Rules that had once been preserved only in the minds of elders or priests could now be recorded. Over time, this would undermine the monopoly of the aristocracy over legal knowledge. At this stage, however, written laws had not yet reshaped Athenian society. That transformation was still to come. Athens was not alone in facing these pressures. Across the Greek world in the Archaic Age, many city-states experienced similar patterns. Concentration of land in fewer hands, debt bondage, competition among elites, and the rise of new social groups enriched by trade or military service. In some places, these tensions led to the rise of tyrants, single rulers who seized power with popular support against rival aristocrats. In others, reforms were attempted to balance the interests of different classes. Within Athens, competition among aristocratic families often took harsh forms. Rival clans vied for prestige, offices, and influence. Feuds could erupt into violence, bloodshed, and vendettas that dragged on for generations. Some families, such as the Alcmaeonids, later became known for both their power and their involvement in controversial events, including sacrilegious killings that led to long-lasting curses. These internal struggles weakened the sense of common purpose at the top of society and made the system more unstable. The ordinary population felt the impact of these elite conflicts as well. When great families fought, lesser people were drawn into their quarrels as followers, retainers, or victims. Land might be confiscated or destroyed. The city could become polarized between factions supporting different noble leaders. In such an atmosphere, the question of who should rule and under what laws became more pressing. Gradually, awareness grew that the existing arrangements were not sustainable. A society could not function well if a large part of its citizen body was sinking into debt slavery, while a small group dominated politics and justice. The potential for open revolt was always present, even if it did not always break out into large-scale violence. Athenians of later generations remembered this period as one of great social strain when the city stood on the edge of crisis. At the same time, the broader Greek world was opening new horizons. Contact with places such as Lydia, Egypt, and the cities of Asia Minor brought new ideas about law, trade, and statecraft. Poets and wise men, sometimes traveling between cities, began to reflect on justice, order, and the proper balance between rich and poor. Although Athens had not yet produced the philosophers it would later be famous for, it was already part of a network of conversations about what made a community stable and fair. When the pressure of social conflict in Athens became too great for old customs to handle, the city turned to a new kind of figure: the lawgiver. These were individuals given special authority to write rules that would bind the whole community. Their work marks the shift from an unwritten world of tradition, controlled by aristocratic memory, to a written world of public law. In Athens, two names stand out at this early stage: Draco and Solon. They did not create democracy, but they changed the way Athenians understood justice and the state. Draco belongs to the late 7th century BCE, a time when feuds, bloodshed, and disputes over land and debt were tearing at the fabric of Athenian society. Up to that point, serious crimes, especially homicide, were often handled through private arrangements between families. A killing could lead to revenge, negotiation, or compensation, depending on the strength and willingness of the families involved. For the aristocracy, who had the connections and force to protect themselves, this system might still work. For others, it meant insecurity and a constant risk of violence. The Athenians responded by appointing Draco to write down laws, particularly about homicide. Instead of leaving judgments entirely to the customs known by a few elite magistrates, the city now had a body of rules that could be inscribed and displayed. Even if many citizens could not read, the fact that laws existed publicly meant that the archons were at least in theory bound by something more than their own will. This was a major mental shift. Law began to be seen as a set of fixed commands issued by the city, not just the habit of the powerful. Draco's laws quickly gained a reputation for extreme severity. Later, Athenians used the word draconian to describe anything excessively harsh. According to tradition, Draco imposed the death penalty for a wide range of offenses, even minor ones. When questioned, he was said to have replied that small crimes deserved death and that he had no harsher punishment to give for great crimes. Whether he actually said this or whether it is a later invention, it captures how Athenians remembered his code: rigid, unforgiving, and terrifying. However, it would be a mistake to think that Draco's work had no positive impact. His homicide law, in particular, helped move killings out of the realm of personal revenge and into the sphere of public judgment. Different types of homicide, such as accidental killing, killing in self-defense, or deliberate murder, were treated differently. Special courts and procedures were established. The idea that the community, not just individual families, had a strong interest in how violence was handled became more firmly rooted. At the same time, Draco's code did not address the deeper economic and social problems that were driving Athens toward crisis. The concentration of land, the spread of debt bondage, and the resentment of poorer citizens remained. Harsh laws might control open revolt for a time, but they could not remove the causes of frustration. The severe penalties may even have increased bitterness among those who felt that the legal system was stacked against them. By the early 6th century BCE, it was clear that something more than draconian severity was needed. The city faced the danger of internal breakdown. Some Athenians feared that the poor, crushed by debt and threatened with enslavement, might rise in violent rebellion. Others worried that an ambitious aristocrat might seize power as a tyrant, using popular anger as a weapon. Between these fears, the city sought a mediator, someone with enough prestige to be trusted by different sides and enough vision to propose a new balance. That mediator was Solon. Solon came from a noble family, but not from the very richest ranks of the aristocracy. He was known as a poet, a soldier, and a statesman, with a reputation for moderation and wisdom. His verses, which partly survive, show a man deeply concerned with justice, balance, and the dangers of both arrogance and despair. When Athens chose Solon as archon with special powers to reform the laws, they were placing the future of the city in the hands of a man who understood both elite interests and popular suffering. Solon approached the crisis by trying to relieve the most unbearable pressures without overturning the entire social order. His most famous measure, often called the shaking off of burdens, canceled many debts that had enslaved citizens or placed their land under heavy obligation. The horoi markers that proclaimed land as pledged for debt were removed. Those Athenians who had been sold into slavery abroad because of debts were, at least in principle, to be brought back and restored to their status as citizens. This was a radical step because it struck at the power of creditors and ended one of the most brutal forms of exploitation. At the same time, Solon refused to carry out a full redistribution of land. He did not seize estates from the rich and divide them among the poor. In his poetry, he presents this decision as a deliberate choice to avoid injustice in both directions. He wanted to help the poor without ruining the wealthy. For modern observers, this creates an interesting tension. Solon is both a bold reformer and a conservative guardian of property. He tried to steer a middle course, hoping to save the city by compromise. Alongside these economic changes, Solon reshaped the political structure of Athens. Instead of dividing citizens purely by birth and noble lineage, he introduced a system based largely on wealth and productive capacity. Athenians were grouped into several classes according to how much their land could yield. The highest offices, such as the major archonships, were still restricted to the wealthiest classes, but lesser offices and positions were open to those of more modest means. This democratic system, based on property, had several effects. It undercut the exclusive control of the old aristocracy by giving some political role to richer non-noble citizens, especially those who had gained wealth through trade or craft. At the same time, it did not empower the poorest citizens to hold the most important offices. Solon was not creating a full democracy, but widening the circle of those who could participate without completely breaking the link between wealth and power. One of Solon's most important institutional reforms was the strengthening of the council and the popular court. He expanded the right of ordinary citizens to appeal decisions made by magistrates to a larger body, the people's court, in which many citizens could serve as jurors. This created a new path for seeking justice beyond the narrow circle of aristocratic judges. It also made the ordinary citizen body a more active participant in public life. In later times, Athenians would look back on these measures as early steps toward the democratic jury system that became central to their politics. Solon also is said to have created or reformed a council that prepared business for the wider assembly. This body, drawn from the upper property classes, served as a bridge between the magistrates and the people. By spreading responsibility across more institutions, Solon reduced the risk that any single group could dominate entirely. He was building a more complex and flexible structure of governance, where different organs balanced one another. Legal reforms went beyond the economic and political spheres. Solon rewrote many of Draco's harsh laws, though he preserved the homicide code. He issued rules about inheritance, dowries, and the rights of women in certain situations. He regulated public behavior, including luxury at funerals, perhaps to limit displays of wealth and rivalry among aristocratic families. He also encouraged trade and craftsmanship by offering citizenship under certain conditions to skilled immigrants, hoping to strengthen the city's economic base. In his poetry, Solon portrayed himself as a mediator struggling to hold the city together. He described how he stood with a mighty shield between powerful and powerless, refusing to let either side win a total victory. To the poor, he gave freedom from bondage and some access to justice. To the rich, he left their land and many of their privileges intact. He knew that neither side would be completely satisfied. In fact, later sources report that both groups did indeed feel cheated. The poor because they did not receive land, the rich because their debts were canceled. Once his reforms were in place, Solon is said to have imposed an oath on the Athenians that they would observe his laws for a set period. Then he left the city and traveled abroad. Whether motivated by genuine desire to see the world, by frustration, or by a wish to avoid immediate backlash, his departure meant that he would not be present to enforce or interpret his own measures. This left room for new struggles over how his laws should be applied. In the generations after Solon, Athenian politics did not suddenly become calm. Instead, old and new tensions combined in different ways. The property-based class system created new alliances and rivalries. The cancellation of debts had given relief, but deep inequalities in land ownership and influence remained. Ambitious men could still build followings among those dissatisfied with their position, whether rich or poor. A pattern of political factions emerged, often described in terms of geographical bases within Attica. There were groups associated with the plain, where many old aristocratic landowners lived, groups linked to the coastal regions, where trade and maritime interests were stronger, and groups tied to the hillier inland areas, where poorer farmers were more numerous. These rough divisions reflected real differences in economic life and political preference. Leaders arose who claimed to represent the interests of these regions and their people. When Solon stepped away from Athens, he left behind a city that had avoided immediate collapse, but was far from peaceful. Debts had been canceled and new political rules created, yet the struggle among powerful families continued. Different regions of Attica still had different interests, and ordinary citizens remained vulnerable to the ambitions of rival elites. Out of this unsettled landscape would emerge a figure who changed the shape of Athenian politics for a generation: Pisistratus. Pisistratus came from a noble family connected to the coastal region of Attica and was related through a distant branch to Solon himself. He first became prominent as a military leader, winning respect by his conduct in war. Athenians of this period still valued personal courage and success on the battlefield, and Pisistratus used this reputation to build a political following. He carefully cultivated the image of a champion of the poorer citizens, especially those from the hillier inland areas who felt neglected by the great landowners of the plain. At this time, Athenian politics was often described in terms of three broad factions, each tied to a different part of Attica. The people of the plain tended to support conservative aristocratic interests. The people of the coast leaned toward moderate policies and commercial priorities. The people of the hills, many of them small farmers under pressure, were more open to radical change. Pisistratus aligned himself with this last group, presenting himself as their protector against the dominance of the other factions. The story of how Pisistratus first seized power reveals both the tension of the time and his own skill at political theater. According to later accounts, he once appeared in the city wounded and claimed that his enemies had attacked him because he stood up for the common people. This public display of injury moved many Athenians. The assembly, perhaps fearful of renewed factional fighting, granted him a bodyguard. With this armed group at his side, Pisistratus used the opportunity to occupy the Acropolis and take control of the city. This first attempt at tyranny did not last. The rival factions of the plain and the coast, alarmed by his sudden rise, combined to drive him out. For a while, Athens returned to its pattern of competing noble leaders. Yet Pisistratus was not finished. He spent his time in exile, gathering resources and building alliances. In a later episode, he returned with the support of one of the coastal leaders who hoped to use him against others. In a famous story, they staged a spectacle in which a tall woman, dressed as the goddess Athena, rode in a chariot with Pisistratus, and a herald proclaimed that the goddess herself was bringing him back to rule Athens. Modern scholars doubt that Athenians were literally fooled into thinking a mortal woman was their patron goddess. More likely, the staged procession was a kind of political performance that symbolized divine approval and appealed to religious feeling. It shows how myth and politics could unite in a carefully crafted image. Pisistratus understood that power in Athens lay not only in soldiers and wealth, but also in the ability to control symbols and stories. Even this second tyranny did not last forever. The alliance that had brought Pisistratus back broke apart, and he was again driven out. During his second exile, he gathered funds and mercenaries from other regions, including support from sympathetic city-states. When he finally returned for a third time, he did so with enough armed strength to defeat his opponents decisively. He established firm control at Marathon and then marched on Athens, securing the city. From that point on, his rule and that of his family would shape Athenian life for many years. Although Pisistratus ruled as a tyrant, his regime did not resemble the image of a purely cruel and chaotic dictatorship. In the Greek world of that era, a tyrant was simply a man who held power outside traditional constitutional forms, often taking advantage of social discontent to overthrow rival elites. Some tyrants were brutal, others more measured. Pisistratus belongs to the second group. He allowed many of Solon's laws and institutions to remain formally in place. Magistrates continued to be appointed, councils met, and the assembly still gathered. The difference was that real authority lay behind the scenes with Pisistratus and his circle. One of the key features of his rule was a relatively mild and pragmatic approach to his aristocratic opponents. He did not carry out mass killings or confiscate all their property. Instead, he imposed a form of supervised peace. Those who opposed him too strongly were exiled or sidelined, but many were allowed to keep their land and status as long as they did not threaten his position. This helped maintain stability and allowed commerce and agriculture to continue with less disruption than constant factional conflict. Pisistratus also took active steps to strengthen the economic base of Athens and Attica. He encouraged cultivation, especially of olives, by offering support to small farmers. In some accounts, his officials traveled through the countryside, providing loans or assistance to those willing to improve their land. This policy did more than boost production. It tied rural populations more closely to his regime. If a small farmer could point to the tyrant's policies as the reason he was able to survive or prosper, he had less reason to support rival nobles calling for a change of power. Under Pisistratus, Athens also began to play a larger role in regional trade. The city's pottery and other goods found markets across the Aegean, and its harbor, which would later become Piraeus, grew in importance. While the full flowering of Athenian naval power lay in the future, the foundations of a more outward-looking economy were being laid. The stability provided by a single strong ruler, even an unconstitutional one, made long-term commercial planning easier. Culturally and religiously, the tyrant's regime was very active. Pisistratus invested heavily in public festivals, particularly those honoring Athena and Dionysus. The Panathenaic festival, held in honor of Athena, gained new splendor under his sponsorship. Processions, sacrifices, and athletic contests brought together people from across Attica, reinforcing a shared identity. By developing these city-wide celebrations, Pisistratus helped turn Athens from just a political center into a cultural one as well. The festivals for Dionysus, the god associated with wine, ecstasy, and theater, were also expanded. It is in this period that the early forms of tragic drama began to appear in Athens. Poets composed plays to be performed in competitions during the festivals. Over time, this would lead to the great tragedies of later 5th century playwrights, but the institutional framework began under the Pisistratid tyranny. Supporting the arts and religion allowed Pisistratus to present himself as a benefactor of the whole community, not merely a military strongman. Another important cultural development often linked to this era is the organization of Homeric poetry. Some traditions suggest that Pisistratus sponsored a standard version of the Homeric epics for performance in Athens, requiring rhapsodes to recite from an approved text during festivals. Whether this story is fully accurate or not, it reflects how the city was becoming a center for preserving and presenting shared Greek cultural heritage. Once again, the tyrant gained prestige by associating his rule with the great stories and rituals of the wider Greek world. Pisistratus also ordered various architectural projects that began to change the physical face of Athens. He initiated work on temples and public buildings, some of which would only be completed under later regimes. He improved fountains and water supplies, making life in the city more comfortable and secure. Such public works served both practical and political purposes. They provided employment, showcased the power and generosity of the ruler, and helped give Athens a more impressive and ordered appearance. Despite the advantages and relative stability of his rule, it remained a tyranny. The people did not choose their leader through open competition, nor could they easily remove him. His power depended on his personal authority, control of armed forces, and the support of key families who benefited from his regime. After his death, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus inherited this position, turning what had begun as the rise of a single strong man into a kind of family domination. The rule of the sons, known as the Pisistratids, initially continued many of their father's policies. They maintained festivals, public works, and economic support. However, as time passed, tensions grew. One of the brothers, Hipparchus, became the target of a personal and political conflict that ended in his assassination by two men, Harmodius and Aristogeiton. Later, Athenians would celebrate these killers as champions of freedom, calling them the tyrannicides, though the real motives behind their act were complex and mixed with private grievances. In the aftermath of the assassination, Hippias, now ruling alone, became more suspicious and harsh. Repression increased. Exiles mounted resistance and sought allies among other Greek powers. The atmosphere in Athens darkened. The same regime that had once appeared relatively moderate now seemed threatening and oppressive to many citizens and nobles alike. Tyranny, which had brought stability, began to feel like a cage. The turning point came when the exiled Alcmaeonid family, long adversaries of the Pisistratids, secured support from Sparta. The Spartans, concerned about the balance of power in Greece and perhaps influenced by religious or diplomatic factors, intervened militarily in Attica. Under this pressure, Hippias could not hold on. He was forced to leave Athens, and the tyranny came to an end. When the tyranny of the Pisistratid family collapsed, Athens did not immediately become a democracy. The city stepped into a power vacuum filled with old rivalries, foreign interference, and deep uncertainty about what kind of government should replace one-man rule. In this tense atmosphere, one aristocrat, Clisthenes, would push through reforms that reshaped the very meaning of citizenship. His work did not create a perfect system, but it marked the beginning of something new in Greek political life. A city in which ordinary male citizens, not kings or tyrants, claimed the right to rule themselves. After Hippias, the last Pisistratid ruler, was driven into exile with Spartan help, the leading aristocratic families moved quickly to regain open control. Among them, two figures stood out, Isagoras and Clisthenes. Both came from powerful backgrounds. Isagoras represented a more traditional oligarchic interest, while Clisthenes belonged to the Alcmaeonid family, which had been exiled under the tyranny and had now returned with renewed ambitions. At first, the struggle between these two men looked like yet another episode in the long pattern of aristocratic competition that had shaped Athenian politics for generations. Isagoras gained the upper hand by building a close alliance with the Spartan king Cleomenes I, who had played a major role in ending the tyranny. With Spartan support and the aura of military power behind him, Isagoras tried to dismantle the emerging influence of his rival. Clisthenes chose a different strategy. Instead of relying only on noble allies or foreign kings, he turned toward the broader citizen body. He promised reforms that would weaken the grip of old clans and give more Athenians a direct role in government. By appealing to the people of the city and the surrounding countryside, he transformed a factional aristocratic struggle into a wider political movement. Ordinary citizens, who had experienced both Solonian reforms and the Pisistratid regime, now became active participants in deciding what would come next. Isagoras, alarmed by this shift, called on Cleomenes I to intervene directly. The Spartan king entered Athens, declared Clisthenes and many Alcmaeonids cursed, and attempted to expel them and dissolve the council that represented broader citizen interests. For a moment, it seemed that Athens would fall under the combined control of a narrow oligarchy backed by Spartan force. But the Athenians reacted in a way that surprised both Isagoras and Cleomenes. The council refused to dissolve, and the people of the city rose up in defense of their institutions. A siege broke out in the Acropolis, where Isagoras and his Spartan supporters had taken refuge. In the end, they were forced to withdraw. Cleomenes left, and Isagoras was expelled. Clisthenes returned, now with strong popular backing. This episode revealed something new. The citizens of Athens were willing not only to complain or grumble, but to act collectively in defense of their political bodies. With his rivals removed and public support behind him, Clisthenes was in a position to reshape the constitution. The essence of his reforms was not simply to create new offices, but to reorganize the entire citizen body in a way that broke the power of old kinship groups and local factions. Where Solon had focused on wealth classes, Clisthenes focused on redefining how Athenians belonged to the community. Before his reforms, political identity in Athens was strongly tied to family and local region. Noble clans carried great weight, and many people thought of themselves mainly as members of a particular village or rural district. Clisthenes attacked this structure by creating a new system of tribes. Instead of tribes based on kinship, he divided citizens into a set of tribes that mixed together different parts of Attica. Each new tribe was composed of smaller units called demes, the local communities where people actually lived. Demes were scattered across the plain, the coast, and the inland hills. Clisthenes grouped these demes so that each tribe contained people from all three types of region. This meant that no tribe could represent only the interests of coastal traders, or only those of plain landowners, or only those of poor hill farmers. The earlier regional factions were deliberately blended into a new pattern. The tribe became a political identity shared by men who might never have met under the old system. Membership in a deme became the basic marker of citizenship. From then on, Athenian men were enrolled in a deme, and that enrollment was passed down through families. This replaced older practices where lineage and clan ties dominated. It also made the city's records more precise. Instead of saying simply that someone was the son of a certain father from a noble house, one could say that he belonged to a specific deme and tribe, linking him to the broader civic structure. These new tribes were not just names on a list. They formed the framework for political, military, and religious life. Each tribe contributed men to the army, sending contingents that fought side by side in battle. Each tribe also took turns providing officials and serving in important positions. Religious festivals were organized along tribal lines, strengthening solidarity among members. The result was a powerful new way of binding the people of Attica together, cutting across older loyalties. Clisthenes also restructured the council, which played a crucial role in running the city. Under his reforms, the council was enlarged and redesigned as the Council of 500. Each of the new tribes sent an equal number of representatives chosen from among their citizen members. Because the council prepared business for the assembly and oversaw many aspects of administration, this body became a central instrument of the new order. The method of selecting councillors and other officials was also significant. Over time, Athens increasingly used sortition, the drawing of lots, to distribute many offices among eligible citizens. Although the exact details evolved over the years following Clisthenes, the principle that many roles should be filled not by election of the wealthy alone, but by chance among a wide field of citizens helped prevent the concentration of power. It reflected the idea that every citizen, within certain basic qualifications, had an equal claim to share in ruling and being ruled. Another of Clisthenes' notable innovations was the introduction of ostracism. This was a procedure that allowed the assembly, once a year, to vote on whether to hold an ostracism and, if so, to choose one individual to be sent into exile for a set period without trial or loss of property. Citizens would write the name of the person they wished to remove on a piece of pottery, and if a sufficient number of votes were cast, the man whose name appeared most often had to leave Athens for a decade. Ostracism might seem harsh, but it was not a criminal punishment. The person ostracized kept his wealth and could return after the period ended. The purpose was preventive, to remove individuals who seemed dangerously powerful or who threatened to divide the city before they could establish a tyranny or tear the community apart. In this way, ostracism functioned as a safety valve, a non-violent tool that allowed the people to neutralize potential threats to the new system without constant bloodshed. The reforms of Clisthenes did not erase social and economic differences. Wealth still mattered, and elite families did not disappear, but the balance had shifted. Instead of organizing the citizen body around noble lineages and regional factions, Athens now had a structure that encouraged cooperation across old boundaries. Decision-making rested more firmly with the assembly of citizens, backed by a council reflecting the new tribal order. The city had moved closer to the principle that political authority came from the people acting together. It is important to emphasize that this early democracy was limited. Women, slaves, and resident foreigners had no share in political power. Citizenship itself was restricted to a subset of the population. Within that group, however, the idea that each citizen had a voice and a duty in public affairs began to take root. Participating in the assembly, serving on the council, and holding minor offices were not seen as rare honors for a small elite, but as normal parts of civic life. The immediate effects of Clisthenes' reforms went beyond institutional design. They also changed how Athenians thought about themselves. The new tribes and demes gave citizens a sense of belonging to multiple layers of community: local, tribal, and citywide. Religious festivals, military service, and political duties all reinforced this identity. In place of the older mythology of heroic kings and noble houses, a new narrative slowly emerged, in which the collective body of citizens became the central actor in the story of Athens. The reformer himself did not dominate the later tradition as a charismatic hero. In fact, Clisthenes soon fades from the political record. His importance lies not in personal rule, but in the lasting structures he left behind. Unlike a tyrant, he did not seek to concentrate power in his own hands. His achievement was to create a system in which many could share power, and in which the city could govern itself without depending on a single strong man or foreign protector. Not long after Athens reshaped its political life under Clisthenes, a new and much larger danger appeared from the east. The Persian Empire, stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, began to press into areas where Greek cities lived and traded. For Athens, this confrontation would become a defining experience. The struggle against Persia forced the young democracy to test itself in war, to make rapid strategic decisions, and to take risks that could easily have destroyed the city. Instead, victory in these conflicts transformed Athens into a leading power in the Greek world. The first serious spark came from the region of the eastern Aegean, where Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor lived under Persian control. These Ionian poleis had been conquered earlier and were ruled through local tyrants loyal to the great king. Many of their citizens resented this domination. In the later 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, tensions grew, eventually erupting into a revolt. Leaders in the city of Miletus and elsewhere sought help from mainland Greece to throw off Persian rule. Athens, still adjusting to its new democratic order, chose to support this Ionian uprising. The decision was not purely sentimental. The Athenians saw the Ionians as kin, sharing language and culture, and they feared that unchecked Persian power might threaten their own independence in time. Along with the smaller city of Eretria, Athens sent ships and soldiers across the sea. They helped the rebels attack Sardis, an important Persian administrative center, and burn parts of the town. This bold move did not bring lasting success to the revolt, but it did have a decisive consequence. It drew the direct attention of the Persian king, Darius I. From his perspective, distant Greek Polius had dared to interfere with imperial rule and had even helped destroy a key city. He vowed to punish them. The Ionian revolt was eventually crushed by Persian forces, and Miletus suffered severe reprisals. But the conflict had widened. Athens and Eretria were now marked for retribution. In the early 5th century BCE, Darius I launched an expedition aimed at bringing the troublesome Greek cities to heel. His forces moved across the Aegean, subduing islands and demanding submission from mainland communities. Many polis agreed to give tokens of earth and water, symbols of surrender to Persian authority. Athens and Sparta refused, knowing that this refusal meant war. One branch of the Persian expedition targeted Eretria, which was besieged and captured after internal betrayal. The city's destruction sent shockwaves through Greece. The remaining Persian forces then crossed to the plain of Marathon, a relatively open stretch of land on the eastern side of Attica. Here, the conflict between the small Athenian state and the vast Persian Empire came to a critical point. The Athenians marched out with their citizen army, joined by a small force from the city of Plataea in Boeotia. Their troops were organized as hoplites, heavily armed infantry fighting in close formation. The Persian forces included infantry and cavalry from many subject peoples. The Persians may have expected that fear or internal division would paralyze Athens, as had happened in Eretria. Instead, the Athenians chose to fight. The battle that followed at Marathon became one of the most famous in Greek memory. Guided in part by the general Miltiades, the Athenians reportedly strengthened their wings and thinned their center, then advanced at a run to close quickly before Persian archers could do full damage. In the clash of spears and shields, the Greek hoplites proved effective against the more lightly armored Persian infantry. The Persian line eventually broke, and many were killed as they tried to reach their ships. The victory at Marathon had several lasting effects. Militarily, it showed that a citizen army fighting on familiar ground and well coordinated could defeat units from a much larger empire. Politically, it raised the prestige of Athens among other Greek states. Culturally, it became a symbol of courage and resistance, celebrated in poetry and sculpture. For Athenians, Marathon proved that their new political system did not weaken their capacity for war. If anything, the commitment of citizens to their own freedom strengthened it. Yet victory at Marathon did not end the Persian threat. Darius I still ruled a vast empire, and his anger at Athens remained. However, internal problems and other campaigns delayed a renewed assault. When Darius I died, his son Xerxes inherited both the throne and his father's desire to settle accounts with the Greeks. Xerxes prepared for a much larger invasion, assembling troops and ships from many parts of the empire. In the years between Marathon and Xerxes' campaign, Athens underwent another important development. Themistocles, a rising political figure, argued that the future of the city lay not only in its hoplite army, but in its navy. A rich vein of silver discovered at Laurium in southern Attica offered a crucial opportunity. Rather than distributing the profits directly to citizens, Themistocles persuaded the assembly to invest the windfall in building a fleet of warships, primarily triremes, fast vessels powered by rows of citizen rowers. This decision was controversial at the time, but would prove decisive. It changed the balance of military power within Athens itself. Hoplites came mainly from the more prosperous classes, who could afford armor, while the rowers were often poorer citizens. By making the navy central to the city's defense and later its power, Themistocles elevated the political weight of these lower-income citizens. Naval strength and democratic participation would become deeply linked in the Athenian story. When Xerxes finally launched his great invasion in the early 5th century BCE, it was on a scale far larger than his father's campaign. Bridges were thrown across the Hellespont, and a canal was cut through the Athos Peninsula to ease the passage of ships. The Persian army and navy moved into Greece, demanding submissions along the way. Some cities yielded, others formed a defensive alliance led by Sparta on land and Athens at sea. The Greek resistance chose to make a stand at key choke points. At Thermopylae, a narrow pass in central Greece, a small Greek force led by the Spartan king Leonidas fought a famous delaying action against the massive Persian army. At sea, a combined Greek fleet confronted the Persians near Artemisium. Though eventually forced to withdraw, these actions bought time and showed that the Greeks were willing to oppose Xerxes' advance. For Athens, the crisis became especially acute. As the Persians advanced, it became clear that Attica could not be held by land. Themistocles and other leaders faced a terrible choice: defend the city's walls and risk annihilation, or evacuate the population and rely on the navy. Guided by oracles and strategic reasoning, the Athenians decided to abandon their homes temporarily. Women, children, and the elderly were sent mainly to the island of Salamis and to other safer locations. The adult male citizens boarded the fleet. The emotional cost of this decision was immense. Athenians left behind temples, houses, and ancestral tombs, knowing that the advancing enemy might destroy them. When the Persians reached Athens, they found a largely empty city. They occupied and burned it, including the Acropolis. For a people who took deep pride in their sacred sites and their continuous connection to their land, this was a shocking blow. Yet, the heart of Athens, its citizen body, remained intact on the ships that now gathered in the waters near Salamis. In the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, the decisive naval battle of the campaign took place. The Persian fleet, drawn into these confined waters, lost many of the advantages of numbers and maneuvering space. The Greek ships, lighter and more familiar with the local currents, could ram and disable enemy vessels more effectively. Themistocles is said to have played a crucial role in drawing the Persians into this unfavorable position, even sending deceptive messages to encourage them to attack. The Battle of Salamis ended with a clear Greek victory. Many Persian ships were sunk or driven aground. Xerxes, watching from a throne set up on the shore, saw his naval power severely reduced. Without secure control of the sea, supplying the massive Persian land army deep in Greece became far more difficult. Soon after, Xerxes withdrew much of his force, leaving a substantial army under his general Mardonius to continue the campaign. The final major clash came on land at Plataea in Boeotia, where a coalition of Greek forces, including Athenians and Spartans, defeated the remaining Persian army. On the same day, according to later tradition, a Greek fleet won another victory at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor, attacking Persian forces and encouraging more Ionian cities to break away from Persian rule. These successes effectively ended the immediate Persian threat to mainland Greece. For Athens, the consequences of these wars were profound. The city had suffered the burning of its temples and the occupation of its land, but it had also emerged as a central player in the victories. The hoplite stand at Marathon, the evacuation of Attica, and the naval triumph at Salamis all relied heavily on Athenian initiative and sacrifice. Other Greek states, especially Sparta, also played crucial roles, but Athens now had a strong claim to leadership in any future alliance against Persia. When the great invasions of Persia had been pushed back and the smoke of war began to clear over the Aegean, Athens stood in a new position. The city that had once been just one polis among many now found itself with unmatched naval strength, enormous prestige, and allies looking to it for leadership. What began as a defensive alliance against Persia slowly transformed into something more ambitious and more controversial: an Athenian empire. This era, often associated with the leadership of Pericles, reshaped not only Greek politics, but the inner life of Athens itself. In the years after the battles of Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale, many Greek cities, especially those of the eastern Aegean and the islands, still faced Persian garrisons or the fear of renewed attacks. Sparta, whose power lay mainly on land, showed less enthusiasm for leading a continuing maritime struggle far from the Peloponnese. Athens, with its large fleet and experience at sea, seemed better suited to take charge. Under Athenian initiative, a new coalition formed, usually known as the Delian League, named after the sacred island of Delos, where its common treasury and council were first established. Member states of this league contributed ships or money, theoretically as equals in a joint defense effort. The idea was that Athens and its allies would keep pressure on Persia, liberate Greek cities under Persian control, and maintain security in the Aegean. For smaller cities, especially those without strong fleets, it seemed practical to pay money instead of building and manning warships. Athens, with its growing navy, happily accepted these payments and used them to expand and maintain its own fleet. At first, the League's campaigns did indeed target Persian positions. Athenian forces, often under skilled commanders like Cimon, won important victories along the coast of Asia Minor and in other parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Some Greek communities were freed from Persian rule, and the threat of a new large-scale invasion declined. Yet, as the external danger eased, a new dynamic emerged within the League itself. Athens began to treat defection or non-compliance not as a free choice by independent allies, but as rebellion against a common cause that Athens now defined. When cities tried to leave the League or refuse tribute, Athenian ships and soldiers intervened. The island of Naxos is one of the earliest known examples. After seeking to withdraw from the League, it was besieged and forced to submit. Its fleet was confiscated, its walls likely dismantled, and it was compelled to continue paying tribute. Similar fates later befell other cities, such as Thasos, which resisted Athenian control over trade routes and mining interests. Step by step, the League became less a voluntary alliance and more an imperial system with Athens at its center. A key practical change was the transfer of the League's treasury from Delos to Athens. Officially, this move was justified as a measure of safety to protect the funds from potential Persian attack. In reality, it signaled that Athens now saw these resources as something it could direct on its own terms. Tribute from the allies flowed into the city, where it helped finance both military forces and ambitious building projects. The Acropolis, once burned and ruined by the Persians, would be rebuilt on a grander scale using, in part, the wealth of subjects who had little say in how their money was spent. Inside Athens, this empire had deep social and political effects. The maintenance of a large navy required constant service from citizen rowers, many of whom came from the poorer classes. Campaigns across the Aegean and beyond provided pay, a sense of adventure, and a feeling of importance for these men. Their role in sustaining Athenian power reinforced the logic of a broad democracy at home. If the poorest citizens were essential to the empire's strength, how could anyone claim that they should be excluded from political influence? It is in this context that Pericles rose to prominence. Coming from a distinguished but not universally loved aristocratic family, he combined noble birth with strong support among the common citizens. Pericles became one of the most persuasive speakers in the assembly and was repeatedly chosen to serve as general, a position that allowed him to guide both military policy and civic life. While he did not rule as a monarch or tyrant, his consistent influence over many years gave Athenian politics a degree of continuity and direction. One of Pericles' important domestic policies was the expansion of pay for public service. Citizens serving on juries, sitting in the council, or performing other official duties began to receive modest wages from the state. This did not make them rich, but it made it possible for poorer men to participate actively in public life without sacrificing their basic livelihood. The effect was to deepen the democratic character of the system, as political participation no longer depended solely on having enough private wealth to serve without compensation. Pericles also sponsored legislation concerning citizenship. A famous law attributed to him narrowed the definition of a citizen, restricting full political status to those whose parents were both Athenians. This move may seem surprising in a democratic leader, but it reflected a desire to preserve the special privileges of citizenship in a city where imperial revenues and public payments made that status particularly valuable. By tightening the boundaries of the citizen body, Pericles both strengthened internal solidarity and sharpened the line between citizens, metics, and subjects. Metics, resident foreigners who lived and worked in Athens, played a vital role in trade, crafts, and professional services. They paid taxes and shared in the city's economic life, but did not enjoy political rights. Below them in status were slaves who labored in households, workshops, and the countryside. The flourishing of democracy at the top of society thus rested on a wide base of non-citizen labor, both free and unfree, whose contributions were essential but whose voices were excluded from the assembly and courts. The empire allowed Athens to support an extraordinary program of public works. Under Pericles' guidance, the Acropolis was transformed into a stunning complex of temples and monuments. The Parthenon, dedicated to Athena Parthenos, rose as a symbol of both religious devotion and civic pride. The sculptor Phidias oversaw its decoration, including the great statue of the goddess and an intricate series of reliefs. Other structures, such as the propylaea and smaller temples on the height, turned the Acropolis into a visible statement of Athenian glory, admired and resented in equal measure across the Greek world. Beyond the sacred rock, the city's public spaces were also improved. Stoas and fountains in the Agora made the central marketplace a more orderly and pleasant place for gathering, commerce, and political conversation. Long walls were constructed to connect the city with its port at Piraeus, creating a protected corridor that allowed Athens to remain supplied by sea, even if its land territory was invaded. These walls embodied a new strategic idea, that a maritime power could survive as long as it controlled the sea, even if its farms and villages were ravaged. Culturally, the age of Pericles saw an extraordinary flowering. While the details of individual thinkers and artists belong more fully to the next section, it is important to note how the political and imperial framework made this possible. The city's wealth supported playwrights, philosophers, historians, and artists. Festivals funded by the state provided venues where dramas could be performed free to citizens, including many who might never travel abroad or see other centers of culture. Athens became a magnet for talent and a training ground for rhetoric and debate. Yet the very successes of the empire seeded serious tensions. The allies, who had once joined the Delian League willingly against Persia, now found themselves paying tribute year after year, sometimes with garrisons or Athenian officials overseeing their affairs. Some saw Athens less as a leader and more as a master. Revolts broke out at various times, and Athens responded with force. Harsh measures were occasionally imposed, including the installation of local oligarchic governments loyal to Athens, or, in extreme cases, the confiscation of land and the resettlement of populations. Within Greece more broadly, Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies grew increasingly suspicious of the expanding Athenian sphere. Many of these states had conservative governments that looked with mistrust on the democratic energy and imperial ambition of Athens. The existence of two major power blocks, one dominated by Sparta on land and one by Athens at sea, created a fragile balance. Minor disputes involving smaller states could easily draw in the larger rivals, turning local conflicts into major crises. Pericles himself recognized the danger of this situation. In speeches recorded by later historians, he urged Athenians to use their power with care, to maintain their alliances, and to avoid unnecessary expansion on land. His strategic vision emphasized holding the empire, protecting the navy, and trusting in the city's ability to outlast its enemies through its walls and ships. He understood that the empire, once created, could not easily be given up without serious internal and external consequences. Tribute from the allies and control of maritime routes had become deeply woven into Athenian wealth and identity. At home, democracy reached a mature form under his influence. The assembly met regularly to vote on laws, decrees, and foreign policy. The Council of 500 prepared the agenda and handled much of the day-to-day administration. Large juries drawn from the citizen body decided legal cases, giving many ordinary Athenians direct experience of judging disputes and listening to arguments. Political life was noisy, argumentative, and highly participatory. Leadership depended not on formal office alone, but on the ability to persuade large gatherings of citizens. This vibrant public sphere brought both strengths and vulnerabilities. On the one hand, it produced citizens who were informed, engaged, and accustomed to considering complex issues. On the other hand, it opened space for demagogues, speakers who could stir emotions without always offering wise policies. Pericles was seen by many as the model of a responsible democratic leader, guiding the people rather than blindly following them. After his time, the balance between public opinion and effective strategy would become harder to maintain. During the middle decades of the 5th century before the Common Era, Athens was not only a powerful state, it also became a remarkable center of art, drama, philosophy, and intellectual experimentation. The same democratic and imperial structures that shaped its politics also created the conditions for a cultural transformation whose echoes are still felt today. To understand why later ages looked back to this period as a classical moment, we need to explore how Athenians built, thought, argued, and imagined themselves during these years. One of the most visible expressions of this cultural flowering was the rebuilding of the Acropolis. After the Persian destruction earlier in the century, the sacred rock above the city had remained scarred for some time, partly as a reminder of what Athens had endured. Under the leadership of Pericles and his allies, the city decided to transform this ruined height into a monumental complex dedicated to Athena and to the power of the community that worshipped her. The Parthenon, the great temple to Athena Parthenos, stood at the heart of this project. Designed by the architects Ictinos and Callicrates and overseen artistically by the sculptor Phidias, it embodied precision and ambition. Its Doric columns seemed regular and straight, but subtle curves and adjustments corrected optical illusions, creating an impression of perfect harmony. Around its exterior ran a series of sculpted metopes and a long frieze. In its inner space stood a towering statue of the goddess, made of gold and ivory, holding victory in her hand. This temple was more than a religious building. It was a statement about Athens itself. The scenes carved on its surfaces showed gods, heroes, and humans in ways that suggested order, balance, and energy. Some scholars see in the frieze a representation of the Panathenaic procession, a festival in which the entire community took part. If this interpretation is correct, the message is clear. The citizens who honored Athena were themselves worthy of being placed in stone alongside mythic figures. The city's own ritual life had become part of its sacred imagery. Other structures on the Acropolis deepened this effect. The Propylaea, an elaborate gateway, turned the entrance into a carefully framed experience, guiding visitors from the world of everyday streets into a space of heightened significance. The small temple of Athena Nike celebrated the goddess as bringer of victory, while the Erechtheion, with its curious and complex design, honored ancient cults and legendary kings like Erechtheus. The famous caryatids, sculpted women serving as columns, blended structural function and graceful form, symbolizing both support and beauty. These constructions were financed in part by the resources of the empire. Tribute from allied and subject states helped pay for stone, labor, and decoration. This created a moral tension at the heart of Athenian culture. On one hand, citizens could be proud of their dazzling sanctuaries and public spaces. On the other, their monuments were tied to a system that imposed burdens on others. The Parthenon was both a shrine and a symbol of power, projecting Athenian influence across the Aegean. Beyond architecture, Athens became the leading stage for drama. At festivals devoted to Dionysus, especially the city Dionysia, playwrights presented tragedies and comedies in competitions supported by the state and funded through liturgies, special public services performed by wealthy citizens. The entire male citizen body, along with many medics and visitors, could attend these performances in the theater, carved into the southern slope below the Acropolis. Theater was not a private entertainment, it was a civic event, where the community watched stories that reflected and questioned its own values. Tragedy, in particular, explored the limits of human power and the conflict between individuals and larger forces. Aeschylus, often seen as the earliest of the great tragedians, drew heavily on themes of divine justice and the transition from personal vengeance to institutional law. In one of his plays, the trial scene on the Athenian Areopagus dramatizes how reasoned judgment can replace endless cycles of blood revenge. The message resonates with the city's own experience of moving toward structured legal systems. Sophocles, another major tragedian, focused more on individual character and moral ambiguity. Figures like Oedipus and Antigone confront dilemmas where every choice brings suffering. Their struggles invite audiences to ask hard questions. What happens when a ruler acts with confidence yet lacks self-knowledge? What is the right balance between obedience to the state and loyalty to unwritten divine laws? These plays did not offer easy answers, but they encouraged Athenians to reflect on the tensions within their own democracy and imperial rule. Euripides, often seen as more critical and questioning, challenged traditional views even more sharply. His characters sometimes doubt the justice of the gods, question the costs of war, and give voice to outsiders, including women and slaves, in ways that must have unsettled some spectators. By staging such perspectives in a public festival, Athens allowed itself to examine the darker sides of its power and its myths, even while continuing to act with confidence abroad. Comedy, represented above all by Aristophanes, added another layer. Comic plays openly mocked political figures, policies, and social trends. Generals, orators, and even the idea of empire itself could become targets of sharp humor. While some jokes were topical and crude, the larger effect was to give the citizen body a kind of safety valve, a space where the community could laugh at its own excesses and anxieties. In a way, comedy functioned as a democratic commentary on democratic life. Parallel to the arts of building and drama, philosophy and intellectual inquiry took root in Athens. The city's wealth, public spaces, and habit of debate made it an attractive place for thinkers and teachers, some of whom were not native Athenians. Among the most influential of these were the sophists, traveling specialists in rhetoric and argument who offered education for a fee. They taught young men how to speak persuasively in the assembly and courts, how to analyze language, and how to question traditional beliefs. The sophists introduced unsettling ideas, suggesting that human laws might be matters of convention rather than divine command, and that skill in argument could shape perceptions of truth. For a democracy that depended on persuasion, their teachings were both useful and dangerous. They reflected a world in which public speech had become a central tool of power. Not surprisingly, they also sparked backlash from those who feared that clever words might overshadow genuine wisdom or moral commitment. Within this environment, Socrates emerged as a distinctive figure. Unlike the sophists, he refused to accept payment for teaching and claimed not to offer a systematic doctrine. Instead, he wandered the streets and public spaces of Athens, engaging people in conversations that exposed contradictions in their beliefs. He questioned politicians, poets, craftsmen, and young aristocrats, asking them to define justice, courage, or piety, and revealing how little certainty lay beneath their confident statements. Socrates' method of relentless questioning challenged the complacency of many citizens. In a city proud of its achievements, he reminded people that ignorance could hide beneath success. His insistence on examining one's life, even at personal risk, created a new model of intellectual integrity. While the full story of his trial and death belongs to a later section, his work in this period shows how Athens could produce not only grand buildings and stirring dramas, but also a rigorous form of self-criticism. Historiography, the writing of history, also advanced in this cultural climate. Herodotus, though not an Athenian by birth, spent time in the city and presented his inquiries into the causes of the Persian Wars there. He combined storytelling with investigation, asking why events happened as they did and exploring the customs of various peoples. Later, Thucydides, himself an Athenian and a participant in the political and military life of the city, would apply an even more severe analytical method to the Peloponnesian War. His work, though focused on a later period, grew from habits of observation and debate that this cultural environment fostered. Education for young Athenian males reflected these changes. While basic instruction included literacy, music, physical training, and familiarity with poetry, ambitious families increasingly sought higher levels of learning for their sons. They wanted them to excel in the assembly, the law courts, and diplomacy. This pushed them towards sophists and other teachers of rhetoric and philosophy. The result was a generation of citizens skilled in argument and eager to participate in public affairs, for better or worse. Artistic styles in sculpture and pottery mirrored the same drive for balance and exploration. Sculptors moved from rigid earlier forms to more naturalistic and dynamic poses. Statues showed human bodies in motion, capturing muscles, drapery, and expression with increasing subtlety. potters and painters depicted mythological scenes, daily life, and athletic contests with refined techniques, turning everyday objects into carriers of narrative and identity. Religion remained a powerful part of Athenian life, but it too was shaped by this cultural atmosphere. Traditional festivals and sacrifices continued, yet poets and philosophers sometimes questioned mythic stories or offered more abstract interpretations of the divine. New cults and mystery religions attracted followers seeking personal experiences of salvation or deeper meaning. The city thus lived in a tension between established ritual and growing intellectual doubt, a tension that made its culture both rich and unstable. Underneath all this creativity lay the social and political realities of the democracy and empire described earlier. The leisure that allowed citizens to spend long hours in assembly, court, theater, and philosophical conversation depended on the labor of women managing households, slaves doing much of the manual work, and allies and subjects contributing tribute and resources. The Golden Age of Athens was not a time of universal prosperity or freedom for everyone within its orbit. It was, rather, a moment when one segment of society, the male citizen body, reached an unusual degree of political and cultural expression, supported by structures that excluded many others. Still, the achievements of this period left a powerful legacy. Later thinkers, artists, and statesmen across the Mediterranean and beyond looked back to the Athenian combination of participatory politics, critical thought, and artistic daring as a model, even when they criticized or adapted it. The image of citizens debating in the assembly, judging in large juries, watching tragedies that challenged their assumptions, and walking among temples that seemed perfectly proportioned became a symbol of what a city could be. By the height of its cultural and political brilliance, Athens also stood on the edge of a long and exhausting conflict. The same empire that had funded temples, fleets, and festivals created deep suspicion among other Greek states, especially Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnese. Tensions that had simmered for years finally erupted into open war, a struggle that later writers called the Peloponnesian War. This conflict did not resemble a single decisive campaign like the Persian invasions. It was a drawn-out, shifting contest that tested the strength, resilience, and judgment of Athens to their limits. At the heart of the tension lay a basic contrast. Sparta led a land-based alliance centered on conservative oligarchic regimes, focused on infantry power and stability inside the Peloponnese. Athens led a maritime coalition, democratic at home and imperial abroad, projecting influence across the Aegean. Smaller states, trade routes, and colonial disputes often became flashpoints between these two blocs. Each side feared that the other's growing power would eventually threaten its security. One early moment of crisis came in a dispute involving Corinth, a powerful ally of Sparta with strong interests in Western trade. Corinth clashed with the city of Corcyra over colonial and naval issues, and Corcyra turned to Athens for help. The Athenians, wary of provoking Sparta but unwilling to let Corinth gain overwhelming control of the western sea lanes, agreed to a limited alliance with Corcyra. Naval engagements followed, and tensions rose further when Athens later imposed harsh terms on the small city of Potidæa and passed an economic decree against Megara, another Peloponnesian ally. To many Spartans and their supporters, these moves confirmed that Athenian expansion threatened the balance of power. Inside Sparta, debate took place among its leaders and allied representatives about whether to go to war. Voices from Corinth pressed strongly for action, describing Athenian behavior as aggressive and intolerable. Some Spartans hesitated, aware that war against a wealthy naval empire would not be easy. Eventually, however, the Spartan assembly, influenced by arguments that Athens would grow even stronger if left unchecked, declared that the treaty arrangements with Athens had been broken. The path to war was set. When open conflict began, each side brought different strengths and plans. Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, could not hope to defeat Sparta's heavily trained hoplites in open land battle. Pericles advised a defensive strategy on land, drawing people from the countryside inside the long walls that linked Athens to its harbor at Piraeus. The city would rely on its navy to raid enemy coasts, protect its trade, and wear down Spartan resources over time. Sparta, in contrast, planned to march its army into Attica, ravage the farmlands, and try to draw the Athenians into battle, while encouraging revolts among Athenian allies. This strategy produced a harsh rhythm in the early years of the war. Spartan forces repeatedly invaded Attica, burning crops and destroying rural homes and estates. Athenian farmers and villagers crowded into the city, turning it into an overcrowded and stressful environment. Inside the walls, Athenians depended on imported grain and supplies brought by sea, while their fleet struck at enemy shores and carried out raids. It was a test of endurance and confidence in the long walls and navy. Then, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. A severe plague broke out in the cramped and unsanitary conditions of the city. The disease spread rapidly among the crowded population, killing thousands of citizens, medics, and slaves. Soldiers, sailors, and even leading figures fell victim. Ancient accounts describe fever, ulcers, and intense suffering, with normal burial customs breaking down under the strain. The psychological blow was as great as the physical one. Many Athenians began to question the wisdom of Pericles' strategy when they saw their families dying behind the walls. Pericles himself eventually succumbed to the plague, leaving Athens without its most experienced and steady leader. In the years that followed, the political stage was dominated by a series of more aggressive and sometimes impulsive figures. Public debate in the assembly grew sharper, with demagogues appealing to popular emotions and promising quick victories. The confidence that had once seemed disciplined and strategic increasingly turned into impatience and risk-taking. Even amid suffering, the war did not move in a straight line. Athens won important successes at sea and in some land operations, including campaigns in western Greece and against Spartan allies in the north. The city's navy remained formidable, and many Athenian allies stayed loyal or were forced back into line when they tried to revolt. Sparta, for its part, faced difficulties coordinating distant operations and lacked the financial resources to sustain constant campaigns. At times, peace seemed possible. A treaty known as the Peace of Nicias aimed to freeze the conflict, but it proved shaky and incomplete. A turning point came with the Athenian decision to launch a massive expedition to Sicily. The city of Syracuse, a powerful polis in the west, became the target of an ambitious plan to expand Athenian influence far beyond the Aegean. Some Athenians argued that controlling Sicily would give Athens access to rich resources and further encircle the Peloponnesian alliance. Others, including more cautious voices like Nicias, warned that the undertaking was risky and distracted attention from the main threat closer to home. Despite these warnings, or perhaps partly because bold plans appealed to a war-weary people, the assembly approved the expedition. The charismatic and controversial leader Alcibiades championed the campaign, presenting it as a chance for glory and profit. A huge fleet and army were assembled, one of the largest forces Athens had ever sent abroad. The departure of the expedition, with hundreds of ships and thousands of men sailing into the west, must have been an impressive and unsettling spectacle. Almost immediately, problems arose. Religious scandals and political maneuvering led to the recall of Alcibiades to face charges, and he eventually fled to avoid trial, offering his services at different times to Sparta and Persia. Leadership in Sicily fell to others, including Nicias, who increasingly doubted the wisdom of the mission, but felt bound by duty to continue. Spartan advisors and reinforcements arrived to aid Syracuse, turning what Athens had hoped would be a swift demonstration of strength into a prolonged and difficult siege. The Sicilian campaign ended in catastrophe. Athenian forces became bogged down around Syracuse, suffering from disease, supply shortages, and effective counterattacks. Attempts to withdraw or regroup were poorly timed. In the final stages, the Athenian fleet was trapped in the harbor, and desperate naval battles failed to break out. When the Athenians tried to retreat overland, many were killed or captured. Nicias and another general, Demosthenes, were executed. Thousands of Athenian prisoners ended up in harsh conditions in Sicilian stone quarries. News of the disaster shocked Athens and the Greek world. A city that had prided itself on naval mastery had suffered a devastating defeat far from home. The loss in Sicily severely weakened Athenian resources and morale. Ships, men, and money had been poured into a campaign that not only failed, but left Athens dangerously exposed. Allies saw that the empire was not invincible. Sparta, encouraged by the setback, renewed its efforts with greater confidence. At the same time, internal tensions grew within Athens itself. Discontent with the way the war was being handled opened the door to political experiments, including brief periods when more oligarchic governments tried to replace the full democracy, claiming that a narrower leadership could manage the crisis more effectively. Sparta also adapted its strategy. With advice from defectors like Alcibiades and support from Persian satraps eager to weaken both Greek powers, the Spartans built up a fleet of their own. Persian money helped them pay rowers and challenge Athenian control of the sea more directly. Naval battles in the eastern Aegean now became crucial. Athens still showed remarkable resilience, winning victories at times and even briefly recovering some confidence after successes such as the Battle of Arginusi, where a hastily assembled fleet managed to defeat a Spartan squadron. Yet each victory came with new strains. After Arginusi, a storm prevented the rescue of many shipwrecked sailors, and public anger in Athens led to the controversial trial and execution of several victorious generals. This episode revealed how war weariness and political passion could undermine sound judgment. The city's capacity to manage crisis calmly had been eroded by years of losses, reversals, and internal suspicion. The final decisive blow came at Aegospotami on the shores of the Hellespont. There, a Spartan fleet under the commander Lysander managed to catch the Athenian navy off guard. When the Athenians beached their ships and dispersed in search of supplies, the Spartans launched a sudden attack, capturing or destroying most of the fleet. Only a handful of ships escaped. With its navy shattered, Athens could no longer protect its grain routes from the Black Sea or defend itself by sea. The city, which had once seemed untouchable behind its long walls, now faced isolation and starvation. Sparta and its allies moved to complete the siege. Their forces blocked supplies by land and sea, and famine began to grip Athens. Inside the city, political divisions grew sharper as some argued for holding out at any cost, while others saw no hope in continued resistance. Eventually, with people starving and no prospect of relief, the Athenians agreed to negotiate. The terms imposed were harsh, but stopped short of total destruction. The long walls were torn down, the fleet reduced to a few ships, and the empire dismantled. Sparta claimed to have liberated the Greeks from Athenian domination. With military defeat came a deep sense of shock and confusion. For decades, Athenians had believed in their city's special destiny, its democratic energy, and its naval power. Now they faced the reality of loss and subordination. The war had consumed enormous human and material resources, reshaped alliances, and left scars on every level of society. Many citizens had died in battle, from disease, or in disaster abroad. Families were broken, fortunes ruined, and confidence shaken. The surrender of Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War did not only mean the loss of ships, walls, and empire. It also opened a deep struggle over what kind of city Athens would be after defeat. For decades, the democracy had defined Athenian identity. Now, under Spartan pressure and internal division, Athens entered a dark phase of oligarchic rule, civil conflict, and painful self-examination. Out of this turmoil came both a renewed democracy and the death of its most famous questioner, Socrates. When Athens capitulated to Sparta, the terms imposed included the dismantling of the long walls and the reduction of the fleet. But Sparta also wanted a friendly government in place, one that would not revive Athenian ambitions. Within Athens, some aristocratic and oligarchic groups had long resented the radical democracy and the dominance of the poorer citizens in public life. These men saw in defeat an opportunity to reshape the city according to their own ideals, with narrower political participation and closer ties to Sparta. With Spartan support, a small group of oligarchs took control of the government. This regime is commonly known as the 30 Tyrants, though its members thought of themselves as reformers restoring order and virtue. Led by figures such as Critias and Theramenes, they abolished many democratic institutions, restricted political rights to a tiny elite, and set up a council and boards composed largely of their own supporters. In theory, they claimed to be creating a more rational and disciplined state. In practice, their rule quickly became violent and repressive. The 30 relied on a Spartan garrison and on a circle of armed followers to enforce their decrees. They drew up lists of citizens considered enemies of the new order, many of whom were executed or driven into exile. Property confiscations became a way to reward supporters and finance the regime. Personal grievances, ideological hostilities, and greed all mixed together in the rush to eliminate opponents. Even Theramenes, who initially cooperated with the oligarchic project but later criticized its extremism, was put to death after a show trial orchestrated by Critias. For ordinary Athenians, the time of the 30 brought fear and bitterness. People were arrested without fair process, neighbors were turned into accusers, and basic legal protections were ignored. The promises that oligarchic rule would bring stability and justice rang hollow. Instead, the city, already weakened by war and famine, now faced internal terror. Some citizens managed to escape to friendly or neutral regions where they began to organize resistance. One of the key leaders of this resistance was Thrasybulus, an experienced commander who had remained loyal to the democracy during the war. From a base in Thebes and other locations in Boeotia, he and a growing band of exiles gathered arms and supporters. Step by step, they moved closer to Attica, eventually seizing the border stronghold of Phyle, which commanded important routes. From there, they launched raids and began to win over more sympathizers who opposed the 30. The conflict escalated when the democratic exiles moved from Phyle to the Piraeus, the harbor area of Athens. Battles followed between the forces of the 30 and the growing democratic army. In one clash at the place called Munichia, Critias himself was killed. His death weakened the most extreme faction of the oligarchs. Within Athens, some members of the broader oligarchic camp began to doubt the wisdom and viability of the current regime. Sparta also played a complex role. While one Spartan faction, represented by the commander Lysander, supported the harsh oligarchy in Athens, another group, including the king Pausanias, preferred a more balanced approach. They feared that unrestrained brutality in Athens would destabilize the region and perhaps encourage future revolts. Spartan troops eventually intervened as mediators between the warring Athenian factions rather than as simple backers of the 30. A compromise was reached. The most notorious members of the 30 and their close collaborators were excluded from the restored community and allowed to withdraw to Eleusis, while the bulk of the citizen body was readmitted to political life under a revived democracy. Crucially, an amnesty was proclaimed. Past political crimes, with few exceptions, would not be prosecuted. This amnesty was not simply a gracious gesture. It was a practical necessity. Without it, cycles of revenge could have torn Athens apart for generations. By agreeing to draw a line under the worst atrocities, the Athenians gave themselves a chance to rebuild shared institutions. The restored democracy did not simply return to the exact same form it had before the war. It carried the memory of defeat and internal terror, and it tried to protect itself against similar breakdowns. Some institutional adjustments were made to strengthen legal procedures and to limit sudden, radical changes pushed through by temporary majorities in the assembly. Greater emphasis was placed on the rule of law and on checks against hasty decisions in matters of capital punishment and constitutional reform. Nevertheless, the core features of the democracy remained: a large assembly of citizens, a council chosen by lot, popular juries, and broad participation in public roles. The fact that the democracy was brought back, rather than replaced permanently by oligarchy, says much about how deeply it had become woven into Athenian identity. For many citizens, the experience of the 30 confirmed their belief that narrow elite rule led to corruption and brutality, not stability and justice. In this tense and reflective atmosphere, the figure of Socrates became increasingly prominent, not as a politician, but as a symbol of intellectual challenge. Socrates had lived through the rise and fall of the empire, the Long War, the oligarchic terror, and the Restoration. He had connections with various influential people, including some of the men later associated with the 30, such as Critias and Charmides, who had been among his younger acquaintances in earlier years. He also conversed with aspiring democratic politicians, generals, and ordinary citizens. Socrates did not hold office or propose laws, but his constant questioning of assumptions made him a disturbing presence. He asked respected men to explain what they meant by justice, piety, courage, or moderation, and he showed how often their definitions collapsed under scrutiny. He rejected the idea that rhetorical skill or popular success proved wisdom. Instead, he insisted that recognizing one's own ignorance was the first step toward genuine understanding. This stance earned him both admirers and enemies. After the restoration of democracy, the city was determined to reassert its values and to distance itself from the horrors of oligarchic rule. Many Athenians wondered how people like Critias had become so powerful and why some citizens had supported or tolerated the 30. Suspicion fell on anything that seemed to undermine traditional respect for the laws of the city or the gods who upheld them. In this climate, the unconventional stance of Socrates, his habit of challenging authorities, and his association with some disgraced figures combined to make him a target. A formal charge was brought against him by 3 citizens, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon. The indictment accused Socrates of impiety, of not acknowledging the gods of the city and introducing new divinities, and of corrupting the youth. These charges were framed in religious and moral terms, but behind them lay broader anxieties. Many in the restored democracy feared anything that seemed to question the shared beliefs and loyalties that they thought essential for civic unity. At his trial, held before a large jury of citizens, Socrates defended himself not by flattering the court or pleading for mercy, but by reaffirming his way of life. He argued that he believed in divine guidance, that he had always obeyed the laws, and that his questioning benefited the city by preventing complacency and arrogance. He reminded the jurors that he had refused to carry out unjust orders even under the 30, and had always tried to follow what he saw as the just path. When asked to propose an alternative punishment if found guilty, Socrates famously suggested that, rather than being punished, he deserved free meals at public expense for his service to the city. Only later, under pressure, did he mention a fine, supported by his friends. His refusal to show the kind of emotional self-abasement that Athenian juries often expected from defendants likely harmed his case. To many jurors, he appeared provocative and unrepentant. The jury voted to convict. The margin may not have been overwhelming, but it was decisive. After the verdict, a second vote determined the penalty, and the majority accepted the proposed sentence of death by drinking hemlock. While the legal procedure followed the city's norms, the result left a lasting sense of unease among later observers. Athens, a city that prided itself on free speech and open debate, had executed a man whose main crime, in the eyes of many, was persistent questioning. In the days before his death, Socrates stayed in prison, conversing with his friends and refusing offers to escape into exile. According to accounts written by his student Plato and by Xenophon, he maintained that it was better to die obeying the laws than to undermine the legal order by illegal flight, even if he disagreed with the verdict. This stance reflected his complex loyalty. He criticized the city, but also saw himself as bound by the social contract that had shaped his life. The execution of Socrates became a turning point in the intellectual history of Athens. For some, it showed the dangers of democracy, which could be swayed by fear and resentment to kill its own benefactors. For others, it underscored the need to guard religious and civic norms against disruptive influences. For Plato, it prompted a lifelong exploration of how a just city should be organized and how true knowledge could be achieved. His dialogues, many set in Athens and featuring Socrates as the central voice, preserved the memory of his teacher's method and personality while pushing philosophical thought in new directions. In everyday political life, the restored democracy continued to function, though without the old imperial might. Athens remained an important city, with active courts, assemblies, and cultural institutions. It still possessed a fleet, though a smaller one, and engaged in regional alliances and rivalries. Sparta's victory had not brought lasting stability to Greece. Other powers, such as Thebes, rose and challenged Spartan dominance. Athens would at times ally with former enemies to balance against new threats. The Athens that emerged from the Peloponnesian War and the terror of the 30 tyrants was no longer the confident imperial power of the earlier 5th century before the Common Era. Yet it was still a major Greek city, proud of its democratic traditions, famous for its culture, and capable of playing a role in regional politics. For a time, Athens tried to navigate a landscape where several Greek states competed for influence. But in the background, a new force was rising in the north, Macedon, under kings who were building a different kind of power from anything the old city-states had known. In the early part of the 4th century before the Common Era, the balance among Greek polis remained unstable. Sparta, though victorious over Athens, struggled to maintain control over other Greeks, especially in central Greece. Thebes, under leaders like Epaminondas, challenged Spartan dominance and won major victories, briefly turning Thebes into a leading power. Athens, seeking to recover some of its stature, cautiously rebuilt its fleet and entered new alliances, including a second maritime league. But all of these efforts took place within the familiar framework of city-state competition. Shifting coalitions, limited resources, and frequent wars that exhausted everyone. Meanwhile, Macedon, a kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek world, was transforming itself. Earlier Macedonian kings had often been seen by southern Greeks as semi-barbarian, on the fringe of Hellenic culture. That view began to change under Philip II. Educated for a time in Thebes, Philip learned from the best Greek generals and statesmen. When he became king, he reorganized the Macedonian army, creating a disciplined infantry armed with long spears in a flexible formation, supported by strong cavalry. He also used marriage alliances, diplomacy, and strategic bribery to expand his influence. As Philip II extended Macedonian control over neighboring regions and approached the Greek city-states, Athenians had to decide how to respond. Some believed that Macedon could be a useful ally, or at least a distant concern. Others saw a grave threat. The most famous voice warning against Philip was the Athenian orator Demosthenes. In a series of speeches later known as the Philippics, Demosthenes argued that Philip aimed at domination of all Greece and that Athens must resist firmly, rebuild its military forces, and form strong alliances. Despite his powerful rhetoric, Demosthenes faced serious obstacles. Athens was divided internally between those who favored a more cautious, accommodationist approach and those who supported active resistance. The city's finances were limited, and many citizens preferred to spend public money on festivals or domestic payments, rather than on costly military preparations. Memories of the long and bitter Peloponnesian War made some Athenians reluctant to risk another large conflict, especially one whose outcome was uncertain. Philip II advanced step by step, gaining control over key territories such as Thessaly and intervening in disputes among Greek states in ways that increased his influence. Athens, Thebes, and other cities sometimes opposed him, sometimes negotiated, and sometimes hesitated. A series of uneasy truces and shifting alliances followed. Eventually, however, the confrontation could no longer be postponed. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Chaeronea in Boeotia. There, a coalition of Athenians, Thebans, and other Greek forces faced the Macedonian army. The battle was hard-fought. The Theban Sacred Band, a renowned elite infantry unit, fought bravely but was overwhelmed. The young Alexander, son of Philip, commanded part of the Macedonian forces and played a key role in the victory. When the fighting ended, the allied Greek army lay defeated. The outcome signaled the end of effective military resistance by the old city-states against Macedon. For Athens, the defeat at Chaeronea was a profound shock. The city had once stood against the massive Persian Empire and won. Now, it had been overpowered by a Greek kingdom from the north. Yet Philip II chose not to destroy Athens. He respected its prestige and understood that outright annihilation would stir dangerous resentment. Instead, he imposed moderate terms. Athens had to dissolve parts of its league, hand over some ships, and accept Macedonian leadership, but it retained internal self-government and its status as a cultural center. Philip then formed a new political structure known as the League of Corinth. Most Greek states, except Sparta, were enrolled in this league, which recognized Philip as hegemon, leader, and commander of a united Greek military force. The League's stated purpose was to maintain peace among member states and to prepare a common campaign against Persia, presenting the coming expedition as revenge for past invasions and as liberation for Greek cities in Asia Minor. For the first time, much of Greece was formally united under a single leadership, though not on democratic terms. When Philip II was assassinated, his son Alexander inherited this ambitious project. Alexander, soon known as Alexander the Great, moved quickly to secure his control over Macedon and the Greek League. Some cities, sensing an opportunity to break free, hesitated or rebelled. Thebes rose in open revolt. Alexander responded with overwhelming force, destroying much of the city and selling many of its inhabitants into slavery, while sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. This brutal act was meant as a warning. The League would not tolerate defiance. Athens watched all this with anxiety. The destruction of Thebes showed what might happen to a city that misjudged Alexander's resolve. While there were voices in Athens urging resistance, the city's leaders chose caution. They sent embassies to Alexander, offered tokens of loyalty, and avoided open rebellion. In return, he left Athens largely intact, recognizing its cultural prestige and perhaps valuing its support, or at least its neutrality, in the campaign he was about to undertake. Alexander then launched his famous invasion of the Persian Empire, leading a mixed army of Macedonian and allied Greek forces across the Hellespont into Asia. As he advanced through Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and into the heart of Persia, Athens played no direct military role. It remained in Greece, formerly part of the League, watching from a distance as news of Alexander's stunning victories arrived. The old Persian enemy, which Athens had once fought at Marathon and Salamis, was now being crushed by a new conqueror, whose ambitions extended far beyond the Aegean. During these years, Athens continued its civic and cultural life under Macedonian supremacy. The city retained its democratic institutions in a limited form, though Macedonian influence and the presence of royal representatives could not be ignored. The Athenians still met in assembly, still held festivals, still listened to philosophers and dramatists, but their foreign policy was tightly constrained. They could not freely choose war or peace. Those decisions now flowed from Macedonian courts and councils. The death of Alexander in the east created a new and uncertain era. His empire, stretched across vast territories, had no clear successor. His generals, known as the Diadochi, struggled for control, dividing the realm into competing kingdoms. In this chaos, Greek cities, including Athens, saw a chance to regain more autonomy. In what is often called the Lamian War, Athens and some allies rose against Macedonian authority, hoping that the temporary weakness after Alexander's death would allow them to break free. At first, the rebels won some successes, but Macedonian forces eventually regrouped. The war ended with another defeat for Athens and its allies. The settlement that followed reduced Athenian independence even further. A Macedonian garrison was installed in the nearby stronghold of Munichia, overlooking the harbor, and voting rights in Athens were restricted by property qualifications, excluding many poorer citizens from direct political participation. The city retained a democratic form, but under strong external pressure and with a narrower citizen body. In the decades that followed, Athens lived within the shifting patterns of the Hellenistic world. Different Macedonian dynasties and their rivals, such as the Antigonids in Macedon, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and the Seleucids in Asia, competed for influence over the Greek mainland. Athens sometimes aligned with one power, sometimes with another, always seeking better terms or temporary advantages. It might welcome one king as liberator, and later resent his demands. The city's foreign policy became a delicate game of balancing and survival. Despite its reduced political role, Athens remained a significant intellectual and cultural center. The city's schools of philosophy, such as Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, continued to attract students from across the Hellenistic world. The Stoa Poikile, or painted stoa, in the Agora became associated with Stoic philosophers who taught about virtue, reason, and living in accord with nature. Epicureans met in gardens to discuss pleasure, friendship, and the avoidance of political entanglements. These schools offered different answers to the question of how to live well in a world where the old city-state model no longer commanded destiny. Hellenistic rulers recognized the prestige of Athens and sometimes courted its favor with gifts, grants, or honorary decrees. Kings sent funds for festivals, repairs to public buildings, or support for philosophical schools, hoping to associate themselves with the city's ancient glory. In return, the Athenian assembly might honor these rulers with statues, crowns, or public praise. The relationship was unequal but often mutually beneficial. Athens traded symbolic capital, its reputation, as the home of classical culture, in exchange for material support and a measure of protection. Internally, the city adjusted its identity. It could no longer think of itself as the leading power of the Greek world, yet it could still see itself as the guardian of certain traditions: democratic debate, philosophical inquiry, artistic heritage, and devotion to Athena. The Acropolis, though weathered by time and earlier damage, remained a potent symbol. Festivals like the Parthenon continued, linking present generations to a distant past. Plays by old masters might be revived and new works written, keeping alive a sense of continuity. At the same time, the realities of Macedonian and later Hellenistic dominance showed through. Foreign garrisons, royal interventions in local politics, and occasional punitive measures reminded Athenians that ultimate power lay elsewhere. Popular uprisings and short-lived experiments in independence did occur, but they usually ended in compromise or renewed subordination. The city learned to survive by adaptation rather than direct confrontation. When the age of Macedonian dominance settled into the broader Hellenistic world, Athens found itself surrounded by new kinds of states. The old pattern of many small, fiercely independent city-states had given way to larger kingdoms ruled by powerful dynasties. Antigonids in Macedon, Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucids in Asia, and others. Athens was no longer a serious military power among them, yet it retained something that these kingdoms valued deeply: cultural prestige. In this new era, the city learned to trade its reputation for philosophy, art, and memory in exchange for protection, favors, and a modest degree of autonomy. After the turmoil that followed the death of Alexander the Great, the Hellenistic monarchs understood that associating themselves with Athens could lend legitimacy to their rule. These kings, though commanding armies and large territories, often felt the need to present themselves as heirs to classical Greek civilization. Athens, with its temples, theaters, and philosophical schools, was a perfect stage for that claim. As a result, various rulers competed at times to be seen as benefactors of the city. Athenians, for their part, became adept at managing these relationships. The assembly might vote to honor a foreign king with a golden crown, a statue, or an inscription praising his virtues and generosity. In return, the king might grant Athens grain shipments in times of shortage, funds for festivals, or money to repair buildings and fortifications. Sometimes a ruler would pay for the rebuilding of a stoa or the restoration of a sanctuary, inscribing his name in stone and tying his dynasty to Athenian piety and beauty. Meanwhile, philosophy in Athens entered a new phase. The academy founded by Plato continued, though its teachers gradually shifted focus from Plato's original ideas to more skeptical methods. Aristotle's Lyceum developed its own traditions, blending investigation of nature, logic, politics, and ethics. New schools emerged that responded to the uncertainties of the Hellenistic world. Zeno of Citium taught in the Painted Stoa, giving his name to Stoicism, a philosophy that emphasized living in accordance with reason and nature, accepting fate, and cultivating inner virtue, even in a stormy political landscape. Epicurus, though less closely tied to public life, founded a school in his garden that promised a different kind of happiness through friendship, modest pleasure, and freedom from fear. These schools drew students from across the Mediterranean. Young men from cities near and far came to Athens to sit under trees, walk in colonnades, and listen to lectures on ethics, physics, logic, and politics. Many would later return home to serve as officials, advisors, or writers, carrying Athenian ideas into courts and councils from Egypt to Asia Minor. In this way, Athens exercised a subtle, non-military form of influence, shaping the way elites in many regions thought about virtue, law, and the good life. At the same time, the city's own politics remained constrained. Foreign garrisons could be installed or removed by Hellenistic rulers. Local factions sometimes aligned with one king or another, hoping to gain advantage. Occasionally, the city tried to assert more independence, joining wider coalitions against a particular monarch, only to face defeat and renewed control. Athens no longer set the agenda of Greek affairs. Instead, it maneuvered within a context shaped by royal powers. This pattern continued as Rome began to extend its reach into the eastern Mediterranean. At first, Rome entered Greek affairs as an external power invited by some states to help check the ambitions of Macedonian kings. Roman armies fought and defeated successive Macedonian rulers, ending the old Antigonid kingdom. To many Greeks, the Romans looked like liberators, rescuing them from the dominance of Macedon. Some Athenians welcomed Rome with enthusiasm, honoring Roman commanders and emphasizing shared cultural values, even though Rome was not a Greek city. But liberation soon turned into a new form of dependence. As Roman power grew, its leaders no longer pretended that they would simply restore freedom to the Greeks and then withdraw. Instead, Rome imposed settlements, demanded obedience, and gradually reorganized territories according to its interests. Greek states that misjudged this shift and resisted Roman authority paid a high price. Athens generally tried to maintain a friendly stance toward Rome. The city honored Roman leaders with decrees and statues, offered them citizenship, and emphasized Athens' role as a teacher of wisdom. Many Romans admired Greek culture and saw Athens as the most prestigious place to study rhetoric and philosophy. Young Roman aristocrats traveled there to learn from philosophers and orators, polishing the skills they would later use in the Senate and law courts. Nevertheless, Athens could still become entangled in conflicts larger than itself. During the struggle between Rome and Mithridates, the ambitious king of Pontus who challenged Roman rule in the east, Athens chose the wrong side. Seduced by promises of liberation and perhaps by hopes of recovering lost autonomy, the city supported Mithridates. For Rome, this was a serious provocation. A city that had enjoyed Roman favor was now openly aligned with a powerful enemy. The Roman general Sulla was sent to restore Roman authority in Greece. His campaign against Athens was harsh. He besieged the city and the Piraeus, cutting off supplies. The once proud city was reduced to hunger and desperation. When the Romans stormed it, they inflicted heavy damage. Temples and public buildings suffered, and many inhabitants were killed or enslaved. Although Sulla later showed some respect for Athenian heritage and allowed the city to continue, the sack left physical and psychological scars. It was a brutal reminder that cultural prestige could not protect Athens from the hard realities of imperial power. After this episode, Athens settled into a more clearly subordinate role within the Roman world. The city was part of the Roman provincial arrangements in Greece, though it sometimes enjoyed special status and privileges due to its symbolic importance. Roman emperors and high officials visited, granted favors, and contributed to building projects. In return, Athenians flattered their imperial patrons, calling them new benefactors of the city and weaving them into the long story of Athenian greatness. Under Roman rule, Athens became even more of an educational center. Philosophy, rhetoric, and literature remained strong. Roman writers and politicians spoke proudly of having studied in Athens. The city's theaters continued to host performances, sometimes of older Greek plays, sometimes of new works, or even Roman entertainments. The Agora and Acropolis, though surrounded by new Roman structures, still spoke of the classical past, attracting tourists as well as students. Some emperors in particular showed deep interest in Athens. Hadrian, known for his Philhellenism, invested generously in the city. He ordered the completion of an enormous temple to Olympian Zeus that had been left unfinished for centuries, giving Athens a new monumental landmark. He sponsored the construction of libraries, aqueducts, and other public works, blending Roman resources with Greek traditions. Under his patronage, and that of others, Athens acquired new districts and buildings that bore a distinctly Roman stamp while still honoring Greek forms. Religious life in the city also evolved. Traditional worship of Athena and other Olympian gods continued for a long time, though often more as an expression of cultural identity than as an unquestioned spiritual framework. Mystery cults attracted those seeking personal religious experiences, offering initiation into sacred rituals with promises of blessing or a better fate after death. In later centuries, Christianity began to spread through the Roman world, reaching Athens as well. At first, it was only one more new belief among many. Over time, however, it would profoundly reshape the city's religious landscape. Daily life in Roman Athens combined old and new. Citizens and residents walked through spaces marked by classical temples, Hellenistic stoas, and Roman arches. They might discuss Plato in the shade of ancient colonnades, then attend events in structures financed by emperors. Local magistrates still oversaw civic affairs, but ultimate authority lay with Roman governors and distant imperial courts. Taxes, legal disputes, and military matters were all embedded in the wider Roman system. Culturally, Athens now functioned as a kind of living museum and active school. Students came not only from Greek regions, but from many parts of the empire. Latin mingled with Greek in conversations, inscriptions, and public ceremonies. Ideas developed in earlier centuries were studied, commented on, and sometimes transformed in dialogue with Roman law and practice. Even as new centers of learning arose elsewhere, Athens retained a special aura as the place where so much of classical thought had first taken shape. At the same time, change and decline slowly affected the physical city. Some older buildings were repurposed, others neglected. Earthquakes, wars, and simple wear reduced the grandeur of certain monuments. Economic shifts within the empire meant that Athens could no longer always count on abundant funds from rich patrons. While the city remained significant, it was no longer the only or even the primary center of intellectual life. Places like Alexandria, Rhodes, and later Constantinople shared that role. By the later Roman period, especially as the empire adopted Christianity as its favored faith, the religious and cultural meaning of Athens began to shift more dramatically. Pagan schools and temples increasingly came under suspicion or pressure. Imperial edicts against certain kinds of traditional religious practice would eventually transform the balance between old and new beliefs. Athens, which had once led the Greek world in challenging traditional myths with philosophy, now faced imperial policies reshaping its sacred spaces and intellectual institutions. When the political center of the Roman world shifted eastward and Constantinople rose as the imperial capital, Athens slowly slipped from the front line of history. Yet, it did not vanish. Instead, the city entered a long era of quiet transformation under Byzantine rule, followed by periods of Frankish and Ottoman domination. Each new power reshaped Athens, turning its temples and public spaces to new uses, even as a small Greek-speaking population continued to live among the ruins of its classical past. By the late antique period, the Roman Empire had effectively divided into Western and Eastern halves. Athens belonged to the Eastern, Greek-speaking side, which would evolve into what modern historians call the Byzantine Empire. In this Christian empire, religious life and political identity were now deeply intertwined. For Athens, this meant a gradual but profound shift away from its traditional pagan cults and philosophical schools toward Christian worship and organization. Christianity had reached Athens relatively early, carried by travelers, merchants, and missionaries. Over time, small communities grew into established churches, led by bishops who became important figures in local society. As imperial policy moved from tolerating to actively supporting Christianity, older forms of pagan worship came under increasing pressure. Imperial edicts restricted sacrifices, closed some temples, and discouraged participation in traditional cults. Athens, once famous for questioning gods through philosophy, now became a place where official faith reshaped the use of sacred spaces. One of the most striking transformations was the conversion of the Parthenon. The great temple of Athena, which had once symbolized classical Athens at its height, was gradually repurposed as a Christian church, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, often venerated as the Mother of God. Inside, Christian altars replaced ancient cult statues, and frescoes or mosaics with Christian themes were added. The building's basic structure remained, but its meaning changed. Pilgrims and worshippers now entered not to honor the goddess of wisdom, but to pray to the Christian Virgin, seeing the same columns and marble through an entirely different spiritual lens. Other temples on the Acropolis and in the lower city underwent similar changes. Some became churches, others fell into ruin and were cannibalized for building materials. The old philosophical schools, so central to Athens' identity in classical and Hellenistic times, declined. Imperial suspicion of pagan teaching, along with economic and social changes, made it harder for these institutions to survive. A decisive blow came when the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople ordered the closure of remaining pagan schools of philosophy. Athens, which had once been a beacon of philosophical inquiry, no longer served as a formal center of such study, though the memory of its intellectual past lived on. Economically and politically, Athens in the Byzantine period was a modest provincial town, rather than a major urban hub. The city and its surrounding region formed part of imperial administrative districts, governed by officials appointed from the capital. Invasions and raids by various groups, including Germanic peoples and later Slavic tribes, disturbed the countryside of Greece in late antiquity and the early medieval centuries. Athens, like other towns, had to adapt to a world where long-distance trade was less secure and rural populations sometimes shifted or reduced. Despite these challenges, the city did not become entirely empty or irrelevant. Local agriculture, small-scale trade, and pilgrimage to Christian shrines sustained a modest economy. The Acropolis continued to be a focal point, now more as a fortified stronghold and religious center than as the site of grand civic temples. The fortification walls were repaired or modified to meet changing military needs. Houses and small churches clustered around the ancient structures, integrating them into a medieval urban fabric. Under the Byzantine theme system, which organized provinces for military and fiscal purposes, Athens belonged to broader regional commands. Its strategic value was limited compared to key coastal strongholds or the capital, but its symbolic status as an ancient city persisted. Byzantine writers, educated in classical literature, still knew of the glories of old Athens, even if they saw the contemporary town as a faded echo of that past. A major rupture came with the Fourth Crusade, when Western European crusaders diverted from their original mission and sacked Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire fractured, and various Latin or Western lords claimed territories in Greece. Athens fell under the rule of Western dynasties, becoming the center of a Frankish duchy. For the first time since classical days, the city was governed not by Greek or Greek-speaking elites, but by Latin nobles who brought their own feudal customs, languages, and religious practices. These Western lords, including families such as the Della Roche and later the Acciaioli of Florentine origin, made the Acropolis their fortress and residence. The Parthenon, already a church, now served as a Latin cathedral. Gothic and Western architectural elements were added to the ancient structures, towers, and halls built against or on top of classical foundations. The Acropolis became a medieval castle, its classical lines partially hidden by battlements and new constructions. The contrast between antique marble and feudal stonework symbolized the layering of cultures in the city. The local Greek Orthodox population did not disappear, but lived under Latin Catholic overlords. Tensions between the two Christian traditions sometimes flared, especially over control of churches and lands. Yet, daily life for many Athenians likely focused on familiar concerns: farming, trade, local disputes, and the rhythms of the liturgical year. While the names of dukes changed and international intrigue swirled around them, the inhabitants of the city adapted as they had so many times before, speaking Greek, practicing their faith, and navigating the demands of foreign rule. Over the following centuries, the Byzantine Empire in exile gradually recovered some territories, but it never fully re-established its old strength. New powers rose in the region, most importantly the Ottoman Turks. Expanding from Anatolia into the Balkans, the Ottomans slowly absorbed former Byzantine lands and Latin principalities alike. Athens, as part of this shifting political map, eventually came within their reach. Ottoman forces took control of Athens in the later medieval period, bringing yet another transformation. The city became part of the Ottoman provincial system, administered by officials of the Sultan. The population was now predominantly Greek Orthodox, with a Muslim governing class and smaller communities of other faiths and backgrounds. Turkish became the language of administration, while Greek remained the tongue of the local people. Once again, Athens was a secondary town in a large empire, valued more for its symbolic weight and local resources than for strategic centrality. Under Ottoman rule, the Acropolis retained its role as a fortified stronghold and religious site. The Parthenon, which had been a pagan temple and then a church, was converted into a mosque. A minaret rose against its ancient silhouette. Inside, Islamic prayer replaced Christian liturgy and, long before that, pagan rituals. The reuse of this building for different religions over centuries highlights both its enduring architectural power and the flexibility of communities in adapting old structures to new beliefs. The Ottoman authorities, like earlier rulers, also used ancient stones for new construction. Classical buildings in the lower cities served as quarries for houses, walls, and fountains. Some ancient columns stood half-buried in courtyards or incorporated into mosques and mansions. The city's layout remained shaped by its ancient core, but winding medieval and early modern streets wound between ruins, gardens, and modest dwellings. The economic life of Ottoman Athens centered on agriculture from the surrounding countryside, local crafts, and small-scale trade. The city was not a major commercial hub compared to ports like Thessaloniki or Smyrna, but it maintained a steady, if modest, existence. Markets buzzed with activity, and people from nearby villages came to sell produce or buy tools and textiles. The Orthodox Church, under the overall authority of the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople, remained a key institution in local life, preserving Greek language, liturgy, and elements of identity. From the wider European perspective, Athens during the Ottoman centuries seemed remote and diminished, yet it never completely disappeared from Western imagination. Scholars and travelers who loved classical literature knew the city's name, even if they were hazy about its current condition. From the early modern period onward, a trickle of visitors from Western Europe made the difficult journey to see the ruins of the ancient city for themselves. They wrote travel accounts describing the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and other relics, often through a romantic or nostalgic lens. These travelers encountered a living town, not a deserted archaeological site. Turkish officials, Greek priests, local merchants, and farmers all had their own ways of relating to the ancient stones around them. For some, the ruins were sources of usable material. For others, they were landmarks woven into local stories. Western visitors, however, tended to focus on the classical fragments, often ignoring the lives of contemporary Athenians. They measured columns, copied inscriptions, and sketched broken pediments, sometimes lamenting the damage inflicted by time, war, and reuse. One of the most devastating single events for the classical monuments came during a conflict between Venice and the Ottoman Empire in the late 17th century. Venetian forces besieged the Acropolis, which the Ottomans used as a fortress and ammunition depot. A shell struck the Parthenon, igniting the gunpowder stored inside. The resulting explosion blew apart much of the inner structure and scattered sculptures across the rock and down the slopes. Columns collapsed, walls cracked, and sculpted friezes were shattered. The Parthenon, which had survived earthquakes, conversions, and centuries of changing rulers, now suffered catastrophic damage in a single moment of war. Yet even in this ruined state, the monument continued to fascinate. Enlightenment thinkers and later Romantic writers in Western Europe saw in the shattered columns and open sky a powerful symbol of lost classical greatness and the passage of time. Artists painted the Acropolis bathed in golden light or silhouetted against dramatic clouds, often with small figures of local people emphasizing the contrast between the ancient and the present. These images circulated widely, shaping European perceptions of Greece and Athens long before most people could travel there in person. When the Greek War of Independence broke out in the early 19th century, Athens was still a modest Ottoman town, clustered mainly at the foot of the Acropolis. Its ancient monuments were damaged, reused, and partially buried. Western travelers admired the ruins, but often spoke of the living city as poor and provincial. Few at that time would have guessed that within a few decades this small settlement would become the capital of a new European state, a symbol of national rebirth built deliberately in the shadow of its classical past. The revolution against Ottoman rule began in other regions before it reached Athens. Uprisings in the Peloponnese, central Greece, and the islands created a patchwork of liberated and contested territories. News of these revolts spread quickly, fired by ideas of national self-determination and supported by a network of Greek merchants, intellectuals, and clergy. Athens joined the struggle as the conflict unfolded, experiencing sieges, battles, and shifting control between insurgents and Ottoman forces. For Greek fighters, Athens was not just another town, it was a powerful symbol. The Acropolis, with the Parthenon still standing despite its wounds, embodied the memory of ancient freedom and cultural achievement. To hold that rock under a Greek flag was to claim continuity with a long, if broken, historical arc. At various points in the war, the fortress changed hands, scenes of desperate defense and assault playing out amid the shattered columns and battered walls. The conflict was brutal on all sides. Civilians suffered from famine, reprisals, and displacement. Some parts of the city were destroyed in the fighting. Yet, even in the chaos, the idea of a modern Greek state with Athens at its heart took shape in the minds of revolutionaries and sympathetic observers abroad. European Philhellenes, from poets to soldiers, saw in the Greek struggle a chance to link their admiration for classical antiquity with contemporary political ideals. Great powers such as Britain, France, and Russia, drawn by their own interests and sympathies, gradually intervened. Naval clashes, diplomatic pressure, and internal Ottoman weaknesses combined to open a path toward Greek autonomy. After years of conflict, a new Greek kingdom was recognized, though its initial borders did not include all Greek-speaking regions. The central question then became, where would this new state place its capital? For a time, the seaside town of Nafplio served as the political center. It had strategic advantages and fewer scars from ancient expectation. Yet the pull of Athens remained strong. Politicians, intellectuals, and foreign supporters argued that a state claiming the legacy of ancient Greece could not forever leave its most famous city in the background. Even though Athens was small, damaged, and lacking infrastructure, its name and location gave it enormous symbolic weight. The decision was made to move the capital to Athens. This choice set in motion a remarkable process, the deliberate reinvention of a town into a modern European city under the gaze of the Acropolis. The new monarchy, headed first by King Otto, a Bavarian prince chosen by the great powers, brought with it foreign architects and planners. Together with Greek officials, they drew up ambitious plans for broad avenues, squares, and public buildings inspired by neoclassical styles. Urban planners laid out a new city extending north and east from the old Ottoman core. Straight streets and open spaces were designed to frame vistas of the Acropolis, turning the ancient hill into a constant visual reference in everyday life. Government ministries, royal residences, and later parliamentary buildings were given columned facades and pediments that echoed classical forms. The architecture of the capital became a visual argument. Modern Greece was renewing, not merely imitating, its ancient heritage. At the same time, archaeologists and antiquarians began systematic efforts to uncover and protect the remains of classical Athens. Excavations cleared houses and later additions from around major monuments, especially on the Acropolis and in the Agora. In some cases, medieval and Ottoman structures were demolished to reveal older layers. This process created tensions. On the one hand, it rescued ancient sites from neglect and documented them for study. On the other, it sometimes erased more recent historical layers, pushing aside Byzantine, Frankish, and Ottoman traces in favor of an idealized classical image. As the decades passed, Athens grew steadily. State institutions, schools, and universities drew people from other parts of the country. The establishment of the University of Athens turned the city into a national center for higher education, attracting students who would later become lawyers, officials, writers, and teachers. Political life, from parliamentary debates to street demonstrations, increasingly focused on the capital. Newspapers circulated ideas and arguments, creating a public sphere that linked Athens to the rest of Greece. The revival of the Olympic Games in the late 19th century gave Athens a new opportunity to present itself to the world. When the first modern international Olympics were held there, stadiums and temporary facilities hosted athletes from various countries. For organizers and supporters, the event symbolized a bridge between ancient athletic competitions and contemporary internationalism. Images of runners and crowds beneath the Acropolis reinforced the idea that Athens was again a place where global attention could gather. Yet modernization also brought challenges. Rapid urban growth strained housing, sanitation, and employment. Rural migrants seeking work in the capital sometimes found themselves in crowded neighborhoods with poor services. Industrial development remained limited compared to some Western European cities, making economic opportunities uneven. Still, the city's population continued to expand, especially as political upheavals in the wider region changed demographics. One major wave of change came after the early 20th century conflicts between Greece and the Ottoman Empire, and the subsequent population exchanges. Large numbers of Greek refugees from Asia Minor were resettled in the Greek mainland, including in and around Athens. New districts sprang up to house these displaced communities. They brought with them distinct customs, dialects, and musical traditions, enriching but also complicating the social fabric. The capital had to absorb not only people, but the trauma and memories of lost homelands. During the World Wars and the turbulent decades that followed, Athens became both a stage for national struggle and a place of suffering. In the second of the two great global conflicts, occupation by Axis forces brought severe hardship. Starvation, resistance, reprisals, and political polarization left deep scars. The city's streets saw demonstrations, battles, and later, during the bitter civil war that followed, more fighting between rival Greek factions. The classical monuments stood through these storms, silent witnesses to yet another cycle of conflict on the same land. In the post-war period, Athens entered a phase of rapid, sometimes chaotic modernization. Economic growth, urban migration, and changes in agriculture drove more people toward the capital. Apartment buildings rose quickly, often with limited planning controls. Neighborhoods expanded over hills and into surrounding plains. Cars, buses, and later ever-denser traffic reshaped the daily experience of movement in the city. Industrial pollution and the sheer volume of construction sometimes threatened both the environment and the preservation of historical sites. Despite these problems, Athens also gained new cultural and institutional strength. Museums were expanded or founded to house the growing collections of artifacts uncovered by archaeologists. The National Archaeological Museum gathered treasures from all over Greece, while museums on and around the Acropolis focused on the city's own heritage. Modern theaters, concert halls, and galleries appeared, supporting contemporary art and performance alongside classical revivals. Universities and research centers kept Athens at the heart of Greek intellectual life. Politically, the city remained the focus of national drama. Coup, dictatorships, protests, and democratic restorations all unfolded in its squares and boulevards. When a military junta seized power in the later 20th century, Athens became both the seat of authoritarian rule and the center of opposition. After the fall of the junta, the restoration of democracy brought a new wave of political engagement and reforms. Parliament, ministries, and parties all operated under the shadow of the same Acropolis that had once overlooked assemblies of ancient citizens. In the later 20th and early 21st centuries, Athens also looked outward again, positioning itself as a European capital and a gateway between continents. Membership in European institutions, hosting of international events, and expanded tourism linked the city more closely to global networks. The staging of another Olympic Games, much later than the first modern one, required major investments in transport, sports venues, and urban infrastructure. New metro lines, roads, and public spaces aimed to make the city more navigable and livable for residents and visitors alike. Tourism became a crucial part of the Athenian economy. Millions of people came to walk up to the Acropolis, visit the Parthenon, and explore the restored Agora. Guides and signs explained the complex history of each site, not only its classical phase. Modern Athenians worked in hotels, restaurants, shops, and cultural institutions serving these visitors, while also using the same spaces for their own everyday lives. The city thus lived in constant dialogue between past and present, with ancient stones and modern concrete sharing the same views. Environmental and social concerns continued to challenge Athens. Air pollution, traffic congestion, and the need for green spaces pushed planners and citizens to rethink how the city functioned. Economic crises, particularly those in the early 21st century, led to unemployment, disillusionment, and renewed waves of protest in central squares. Yet in these difficult times, the long history of the city sometimes offered perspective. Athenians could look back on centuries of war, occupation, famine, and recovery, and see their current struggles as another chapter in a long, if uneven, story of endurance. Culturally, Athens today is far from being simply a museum. It hosts contemporary music scenes, film festivals, political art, and experimental theater alongside classical tragedies and concerts. Cafes and bookshops line streets where philosophers once walked, and graffiti sometimes appears on walls near ancient sites, expressing modern frustrations or hopes. The coexistence of old and new is not always harmonious, but it is rich and often creative. The relationship between the city and its ancient heritage has also grown more reflective. Rather than only celebrating an idealized classical age, scholars, artists, and ordinary citizens increasingly acknowledge the full, layered history of Athens. Byzantine churches tucked among ruins, Ottoman fountains near neoclassical mansions, refugee neighborhoods alongside elite districts. The story of Athens is understood not just as the tale of marble temples and famous philosophers, but as the lived experience of many different communities over thousands of years. In this sense, modern Athens is both the heir and the critic of its past. It uses ancient symbols in national ceremonies and tourism campaigns, while also asking hard questions about who built and paid for those monuments, who was included in the democracy that inspired later generations, and how empire, slavery, and exclusion shaped the classical city. These questions connect directly to contemporary debates about citizenship, equality, and cultural identity in Greece and beyond. Standing today on the Acropolis, one can look out over a vast urban expanse of concrete parks, roads, and rooftops stretching toward distant mountains and the sea. The view is very different from what an ancient Athenian would have seen, yet some lines remain the same: the curve of the hills, the bright light on stone, the outline of Salamis across the water. The city has changed rulers, religions, languages, and shapes many times, but it has never completely lost its connection to this landscape. From early villages in Attica to the mythic kings, from aristocratic councils to radical democracy, from imperial navy to subject city under Macedon and Rome, from Byzantine provincial town to Frankish duchy and Ottoman fortress, from revolutionary symbol to modern capital, the story of Athens is one of constant reinvention. Each era left its marks, visible and invisible, on the ground and in memory. Today's Athens carries all those layers within it, a living city that still wrestles with the same questions that first animated its ancient citizens: how to live together, how to govern fairly, how to balance tradition and change, and how to find meaning in the passage of time.